When police responded to an apartment fire, they found a Toshiba laptop amid a batch of chemicals and bomb-making materials. An open file on the laptop revealed a plan to simultaneously bomb 12 U.S. airliners over the Pacific. The potential death toll, 4,000 passengers. Several other files used encryption software that scrambled the writings in secret code. The Philippine police decoded some of the files using a special computer program and uncovered a list of bomb-making recipes. All the evidence pointed to the most hunted terrorist in the world, Ramzi Youssef, wanted for his involvement in the World Trade Center bombing. Youssef's plots were stopped, and he was in U.S. custody within 6 weeks. It was a major victory for international law enforcement and revealed the importance of cryptology, the science of making and breaking secret codes. To trace the development of codes is to uncover the very fabric of civilization. Once a culture reaches a level of sophistication in literacy, science, and language, the demand for secret symbolic communication flourishes.
I think codes go back probably as far as there is language. People had something to keep secret. They needed to find some way to scramble it.
For centuries, codes have been controlled by governments, employed in war, applied in diplomacy, and used in espionage. But with modern technology, the use of codes by individuals has exploded, enriching cryptology and empowering citizens. A communications boom has heightened the need for codes to keep the information private on the internet, at ATMs, and in medical offices. Today's complex codes are the result of a historic seesaw battle between code makers and code breakers that has pushed the very boundaries of science. The earliest known code was an inscription carved into a rock by an Egyptian scribe in 1900 BC. It was an attempt to demonstrate wider knowledge by dressing up the writing. Ordinary hieroglyphics were replaced with unusual symbols, which told the story of the writer's master, Khnumhotep II. Another early code was used for secrecy. A tiny enciphered tablet found on the banks of the Tigris River, dating from 1500 BC, contained a hidden formula for glazing pottery. And the ancient Greeks created their own inventive coding methods.
One of the subordinates of a Persian monarch thought that it might be time to revolt. And he had an agent in the court of Darius the Great, and this agent sent a message to this man saying it's now time to revolt. He shaved the head of one of his slaves and tattooed on the head the word revolt, and waited for the hair to grow and sent the slave down to this man's palace. When the man got the slave, he shaved the head, saw the word revolt, and realized that this was the time, and he did revolt successfully.
In Sparta, a new instrument to encipher messages between legions was used. It was called a scytale.
A cloth was wrapped around a stick and the message written down the side. Wrapped around the stick, the message could be read. Unwrapped, it was scrambled. The message was sent from general to general. Unwrapped, the generals would have a stick of the appropriate length, could wrap the cloth around it, and read the message.
Every code had a key, a secret method of scrambling and unscrambling messages used by sender and receiver. Julius Caesar enciphered his military communications using a key that employed an alternative alphabet by moving each letter 3 spaces to the right. But with the collapse of the Roman Empire in 500 AD, European cryptology entered a dark age that would last for 1,000 years. But another civilization was rising in the East. By 900 AD, Arab society was one of the most literate cultures in the world, and the study of codes flourished. The Arabs were the first to record the methods of transposition, the scrambling of letters, as well as substitution, the replacement of letters with numbers and symbols. They were the first to outline specific techniques of code breaking that involved mathematical or frequency analysis.
The Arabs were very interested in letter studies, and they counted the number of times a character such as Aleph appeared in the Quran, and they discovered which letters began words frequently. They used this information, a statistical source, to learn how to break codes. The most frequent coded letter represents the most frequent plain text letter, and that's how you begin to solve a code, and they were the first to do this.
With the Renaissance, cryptology had a rebirth in Europe. In 1466, an Italian architect, Leone Alberti, developed the greatest cryptologic invention in 1,000 years at the urging of the Vatican. It was a system of rotating cipher disks with 2 rings of letters and several numbers. By scrambling so many letters randomly, it was the first to challenge the Arab code-breaking method of frequency analysis.
Previous systems just replaced A with D, only one at a time. The Alberti cipher disk used a disk in which these letter combinations could be changed from time to time, and as a consequence, A would be represented not by only one letter, but by many letters. This was called polyalphabetic, many alphabet substitution, and it was the basis for many modern cipher systems.
A French diplomat, Blaise de Vigenère, improved the Alberti system in 1586 by creating a grid of 26 cipher alphabets, each shifted 1 over from the last. By use of a key word, encoding and decoding communications using Vigenère's square could be calculated on a sheet of paper instead of having to carry a disk. Unfortunately, Mary, Queen of Scots, did not employ this new development. Beginning in 1568, Mary was imprisoned by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. In 1586, a group of Catholics sought to rescue Mary and put her on England's throne after assassinating Elizabeth. Her rescuers communicated with Mary through secret coded letters.
Her great mistake was in thinking that her cipher system was secure. It was actually being read by Queen Elizabeth's code breakers, and everything about the plot was known. And when it reached a certain critical point, Queen Elizabeth called a halt to it and sentenced Mary, Queen of Scots, to death.
By the 1700s, each European power had its own black chamber, a nerve center for deciphering messages and gathering intelligence. But the real revolution in cryptology was just ahead.
Telegraph, for the first time, made it possible to send messages quickly over long distances. In fact, it made the United States a continental power by increasing its communications power. It also raised the necessity for cryptology.
In 1844, Samuel Morse invented Morse code, a series of electrical dots and dashes to communicate over the telegraph. Because the code was public and messages could be easily intercepted, the need for new secret codes became acute. But the telegraph paled in comparison to the communication industry's next scientific development, one that revolutionized codes and was used with murderous impact in the 20th century. Secret flag signals were used extensively on the battlefield in the American Civil War. Codes will return on Modern Marvels. At the dawn of the 20th century, an Italian physicist, Guglielmo Marconi, changed the world of codes forever. Marconi's invention harnessed radio waves as a new method of communication. The result was an instantaneous transmission of messages across long distances.
The invention of the radio was the most important single event in the history of codes and ciphers. Radio had the great effect of facilitating communications. You don't have to lay wire or anything like that. You can just go out with a radio post and communicate. But it has the great disadvantage of turning over to the enemy every message that you send. So this means you have to put into code every message that you send. So it stimulated enormously the great growth of codes and ciphers.
The ramifications of this new invention were not lost upon the generals. Radio allowed quick communication with field divisions and a more rapid, mobile form of warfare. Radio messages were enciphered and sent in Morse code across the airwaves. But radio transmission revealed every cryptogram it conveyed. It furnished a constant and massive stream of intercepts to the enemy. With the outbreak of World War I, the need for new codes and code breakers sharply escalated. A global battle of secret communications had begun. On August 5th, 1914, British divers from the ship Telconia severed German cable lines in the North Atlantic.
It appears their idea was simply to make things more difficult for the Germans, but it had the payoff of forcing a great deal of traffic that would have gone by cable onto radio. And so it resulted in really a flood of intercepts coming in that otherwise wouldn't have been available.
Once intercepted, messages were sent to Room 40, the cryptanalysis section of the British Admiralty.
Room 40 might be the prototype of modern cryptanalytic organizations. They recruited mathematicians, linguists, chess masters, anybody who was good at puzzle solving.
In September 1914, Britain received one of the greatest gifts in the history of cryptology. Her allies, the Russians, captured the German cruiser Magdeburg in the Baltic and a book of Germany's main naval code. They promptly turned the code book over to Room 40, allowing Britain to break German naval messages and bottle up Germany's battleships for the duration of the war. Code breaking had transformed modern combat.
Being able to read the German naval signals often almost instantaneously was something that simply hadn't happened before in warfare.
On the Eastern Front, cryptography, or lack of it, led to one of the most critical battles in World War I. In late August 1914, the Russians sent 2 armies into East Prussia in a pinchers movement to trap the Germans near the village of Tannenberg. The Germans were outmanned, but had the advantage of listening in on Russian radio communications. Due to the Russians' rudimentary and disorganized coding system, intercepts told the Germans that the Russian Southern Army was moving faster than its northern force. The Germans wheeled and destroyed the Russian Southern Army, capturing 100,000 prisoners, with an estimated 30,000 dead or missing.
This was the first great defeat of the Russians in the war, and it started them on their long slide into ruin and revolution. The Russians did not, at World War I, have a good cipher system, and in part they lost the war because of it.
But the greatest code-breaking event in the history of cryptology began on January 17, 1917. The British intercepted a telegram that was encrypted with the highest German diplomatic code, 0075. It was a mind-numbing system of 10,000 words and phrases attached to 1,000 numerical code groups. The secret message was from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to his ambassador in Washington, Johann von Bernstorff, for relay to Germany's ambassador to Mexico, Heinrich von Eckhardt. The telegram would be deciphered there and sent to Mexico's president, Venustiano Carranza.
It was sent from Berlin to Washington, encrypted on the American telegraph.
Delta 230.
The British intercepted
Yes, go ahead and claim me 5-8, and I'll take part of that
It
disturbance.
was a new diplomatic system which the British had not yet broken.
After receiving the message in the new 0075 code, von Bernstorff's office...
Delta 210, Delta 220, I can show you clear.
In Washington, they took this telegram out of the new
220 so far.
diplomatic code book, re-encrypted it in the old diplomatic code book, and sent it to Mexico City on the telegraph.
But the British had already broken the old code.
The British intercepted that version as well, had versions to compare. Perhaps the silliest, most tragic error that a cryptographer can make.
British cryptanalysts began to decipher the message in the old code in painstaking chunks, constructing patterns using pencil and paper. Within days, they had it. As the meaning of Zimmerman's secret message began to emerge, the import was stunning. Despite the sinking of the American ocean liner Lusitania by the Germans in 1915, America maintained its neutrality with the promise of German restrictions on its U-boats. The Zimmerman telegram outlined Germany's intent to resume unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st, 1917, as a means to strangle Britain.
Occurred 5025 STID by the Joe's Crab Shack, contact Bruce.
Mexico invade the United States.
Charlie 375 route.
Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Germany also asked Mexico to persuade Japan to attack America. The
I have one for transport of U-14G.
financial aid.
Airport 13.
Admiralty was desperate to get a message message to the Americans without alerting the Germans that their code had been broken. A British agent was able to infiltrate the Mexican telegraph office and retrieve a deciphered copy of the message to Mexico's president. Once they had their cover of a supposed leak in Mexico, the British approached the Americans and revealed the telegram.
The whole country blew up. Everybody was incensed.
Substation.
Now suddenly, the whole Midwest was worried about Mexico, and 6 weeks after this message was deciphered, the United States declared war on Germany. So it was probably the most significant event in code-breaking history.
Did was convinced
5511.
that Germany was a national
5511.
and a few months
You
later,
can show me clear 5910 please.
he had a united and angry country behind him, ready to go to war against the Germans.
A single breakthrough by the cryptanalysts in Room 40 had succeeded where 3 years of intensive diplomacy had failed. Code breaking would play an even greater role in cryptology's golden age, World War II. At the end of World War I, the power of the code breakers over the code makers seemed obvious. But by 1917, American inventor Edward Hoover conceived the first model of an electrical machine made with a wired rotor of letters attached to a keyboard. 1 year later, the German electrical engineer Arthur Scherbius independently created an electrical encryption machine similar to Hoover's, with several rotors. The inventions revolutionized cryptography by mechanizing the production of codes with millions of potential variations.
Imagine a hockey puck. 26 electrical contacts on one side, 26 electrical contacts on the other side, wired at random. You shoot an electrical current through into A. It comes out at Q. Lights up a letter. Now this hockey puck turns one space. You shoot a current in again at A. Now it's going to come out at X. And this continues to turn until you go through all 26 revolutions. And then, instead of just having one cipher machine, one cipher wheel next to another, you have several rotors next to another.
By the mid-1920s, Scherbius was mass-producing his new model called Enigma. Over the next 2 decades, he would sell more than 30,000 units to the German military. It viewed it as a godsend. Meanwhile, the cryptology offices of the Allies had dwindled in personnel and quality. But Poland, because of its geographical vulnerability between Germany and Russia, was desperate for intelligence. The Poles set up a world-leading cryptanalyst bureau and hired a group of brilliant mathematicians. One of them was 23-year-old Marian Rejewski.
What Rejewski realized was that if you have a machine that's based on rotors, there's certain mathematical relationships between the way it enciphers a letter in one position and the way it enciphers a letter in the next position in sequence. Even today, it's an astonishing accomplishment of what he did, was able to reconstruct the wiring of the rotors of an Enigma machine without ever having seen one.
In building his own model of the German military Enigma, All Rejewski had was a commercial version of Enigma and his extraordinary math skills. At the time, only a few hundred German military Enigma units existed, and all were kept under tight control by the German army. Then, in 1931, a German traitor, Hans Thilo Schmidt, supplied background information for using the Enigma machine which aided Rejewski's guesswork.
The one piece of the puzzle he did not have was knowing how the keyboard of the Enigma machine was wired up to the first rotor. Maybe he had a good sense of the lack of imagination of the Germans, but he thought, well, maybe they wired A to A and B to B and C to C, and sure enough, that was it. He tried that, and he said the solution started coming out as if by magic, almost, on this paper in front of him.
But the Germans routinely changed the daily key, the indicator setting that determined the scrambling of their daily messages. The daily key was distributed in a monthly codebook to both sender and receiver to code and decode messages. To find the daily key, Rejewski built and connected replicas of 6 Enigma machines together that ran through more than 17,000 indicator settings. He called his new contraption the bomb because of its ticking noise while running the permutations.
Code making had been mechanized with the cipher machines, the Enigma, and now what the Poles were doing after mathematizing their code breaking was carrying it the next step further and mechanizing the mathematized code breaking.
It was a great insight when they invented it, a machine to solve a machine.
The Poles secretly read the Enigma traffic for several years, until they hit a huge obstacle in December 1938, when the Germans added 2 new rotors into the rotation. This exponentially increased the need for more bombs and cryptanalysts to run through the daily settings. Fearing a German invasion, the Poles finally called in their allies, Britain and France. In a small brick hut in the Pira forest south of Warsaw, the Poles revealed their astounding discoveries.
And at the proper moment, they stripped away these cloths, they pulled them off, and there in front of the astonished eyes of the British and the French code breakers were replicas of German Enigma machines.
The British were able to smuggle out the machines 2 weeks before Hitler invaded Poland. They went straight to the government's code and cipher school, otherwise known as Bletchley Park, an ornate mansion 50 miles north of London. Alan Turing, a math genius recruited to Bletchley from Cambridge, soon made a fundamental insight into the workings of the bombs.
The original Polish bomb would just keep sorting through German military messages until they came upon a key word.
Alan Turing realized that there were so many possibilities in the German Enigma machine that they couldn't run through them all, and he had a different approach, and he devised a machine which would eliminate most of the possibilities, leaving relatively few to be tested.
Each of Turing's bombs had 180 rotors that clicked round letter by letter, 20 every second, until they hit the correct one. By this time, Bletchley was filled with hundreds of codebreakers who were divided into huts and labored in shifts to solve the flood of incoming messages.
True meritocracy and rank didn't matter a hoot. And if the guy was good, regardless of what rank, he was given a free hand.
It requires a certain, almost contradictory combination of talents. On the one hand, this ability to deal with detail, but at the same time, this ability to achieve this almost sort of illogical leaps of insight and intuition. It almost is that you wanted, Beethoven with the soul of an accountant.
Soon Britain was deciphering large numbers of the German Enigma communications. In 1943, a British engineer, Tommy Flowers, created Colossus, a mechanism that moved code breaking from electromechanical to purely electronic, which worked much faster. It read Germany's most complex coding system, the 12-rotor Lorentz machine, used by Germany's top commanders, including Hitler. Colossus was a proto-computer, capable of reading paper tape at 5,000 characters a second. The Allied breaking of the German codes played a key role in such victories as the Battle of the Atlantic, the war in North Africa, and D-Day. Allied code breaking shortened the war, saved millions of lives, and highlighted the power of brains over bullets. It also launched the computer age. But there was another coding system used by the Japanese in World War II that the Americans were just as determined to crack. At the close of World War I, American cryptology was rudimentary. But since the early 1920s, a lone genius, William Friedman, had been developing statistical methods to solve the codes of the new rotor machines while heading the U.S. Signal Corps. When Japan switched to a mechanized coding system in the mid-1930s, Friedman's team of codebreakers was soon reading Japan's new red code for diplomatic communications. But solving Japan's codes was a torturous process.
When you're trying to solve a code, you come in every day and look at an inscrutable bunch of letters or numbers. It's anguish. Maybe we should try this, maybe we should try that. Day after day, month after month, year after year sometimes, until finally new messages come in which allow you to see some kind of pattern which you hadn't seen before.
Then, in February 1939, Japan introduced the Purple Machine, a mind-twisting coding system that employed several rotors and telephone switches. But Japan then made a critical human error, an important factor in code breaking throughout history.
The Japanese helped out by sending the same messages in the red and purple systems. This allowed Americans to compare the two systems and make some breaks.
A young MIT electrical engineer in Friedman's group, Leo Rosen, built a machine to simulate Purple's complex scrambling patterns. By 1940, the contraption had automated the decipherment of the Japanese Purple code.
It was a great intellectual accomplishment, made the decryption of these Japanese messages almost automatic. It sometimes would allow the Americans to read the Japanese ambassador's mail before he did.
The Purple code breakthrough led to one of the greatest intelligence coups of the war. Tokyo's ambassador to Berlin, Hiroshi Oshima, made a frontline tour of Germany's defenses in Normandy in 1943. He then transmitted a lengthy description back to Japan in the Purple code.
He describes in incredible detail, down to the caliber of the weapons in the German fortifications, the dimensions of the anti-tank ditches, where minefields were. It was really a gold mine.
The solved message was soon on General Eisenhower's desk. He used it to plan the D-Day invasion of France that was launched 6 months later. Though Purple had been cracked, America still worked desperately to solve the JN-25B code, Japan's secret naval communications. Joseph Rochefort, a longtime cryptanalyst fluent in Japanese, led the effort in Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking branch in Hawaii. By March 1942, after years of excruciating work, JN-25B was broken. On May 14th, a Japanese message was decoded outlining a huge invasion force heading to AF. Rochefort and Admiral Chester Nimitz immediately believed AF was Midway, one of America's key outposts in the Pacific. But Washington believed it was the Aleutian Islands.
Really, it was to shut up the doubters in Washington that Rochefort carried out what's now this famous stunt of having a message sent to Midway, ordering them to send a message announcing that their desalination plant had broken. And then a few days later, a JN-25 message was broken in which the Japanese said that they had intercepted this American message saying that AF was short of water. This really, dotted the I and crossed the T.
The invasion of Midway was the grand plan of Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's legendary naval commander. The intent was to take over the island, draw out the remaining American fleet from Pearl Harbor, and destroy it with a surprise attack. On June 4th, 1942, the Japanese began to attack Midway, but lurking on the horizon were the coiled forces of the U.S. Navy.
Knowing in advance what the Japanese plans were allowed Nimitz to get his carriers there first and essentially to surprise the Japanese.
We knew where the Japanese fleet was coming. We were able to hover off their flank and, unsuspecting of the Japanese, hurl ourselves on the Japanese, sink 4 carriers, and send the Japanese battleships and carriers reeling back to Japan.
That knowledge not only was the turning point for the Battle of Midway, but the Battle of Midway was the turning point in the entire Pacific War.
It was a stunning and flawless operation. And in another part of the Pacific, the Americans were launching one of their own codes, one that would never be broken in World War II. Philip Johnston, a retired engineer living in Los Angeles, proposed using the Navajo language to the Marines in 1942. Johnston grew up on a Navajo reservation and was fluent in its complex forms of conjugation, sounds, and structure. It was remote. Only about 30 white Americans could speak it. No German, Japanese, or Italian had ever studied it. The Navajo were also one of America's largest tribes, with a potentially huge pool of code talkers.
We use the what we call a phonetic alphabet. So we use it by sound. It's nasal sounds and guttural sounds, and interchangeable.
Within weeks of hearing Johnston's idea, the Marines were training 29 Navajo code talkers near San Diego. To avoid confusion, many Navajo words from the natural world were used to indicate specific military terms.
Cheitagahi in Navajo is turtle. And when you send a message and say Cheitagahi on the radio, the receiver writes down tanks, T-A-N-K-S.
By August 1942, the first group of Navajo code talkers saw action during the invasion of Guadalcanal. By the end of the year, an additional 83 code talkers were serving in all 6 Marine Corps divisions.
If you wanted to communicate a written message securely, you had to type it out or write it out. You had to give it to a code guy, but this could take an hour or several hours. With the Navajo code guys, it was instantaneous.
The Navajo spoke directly over the radio, sending and receiving battlefield communications from both field headquarters and from the front lines in their native language.
When you send a Navajo code, the receiver gets it, gives it to the commanding officer. That's how fast it was. 2 minutes against 2 hours.
By war's end, there were 420 Navajo code talkers. After the war, the U.S. government forbade them to talk of their unique contributions because of the secrecy of their code. Only in 1968 was the Navajo Code made public, and in 1982, the code talkers were finally honored with a special commemoration day.
America owes the Navajo code talkers the lives of many of its sons.
The greatest tribute was that their code was never broken. But for code makers, the hunt for a truly unbreakable code is an obsession that continues into the age of computers. American codebreaker William Friedman invented several cryptologic machines, 2 of which were so secret, patents were never filed. Codes were returned on modern marbles. For centuries, governments had controlled cryptology. That would change with the modern age. Soon after World War II, computers began to create codes of almost infinite complexity.
There's a rule of thumb in cryptography. If you double the number of combinations that the code makes, you have to square the number of combinations that the code breaker has to try. So one guy is going from 5 to 10, but the code breaker has to go from 5 to 25. It's much easier to make the number of combinations virtually impossible to test.
But this new encryption was still only accessible to the government. In 1952, President Harry Truman founded the National Security Agency, the greatest collection of computer and cryptologic talent in the world. Its charge was to intercept and decrypt intelligence from all over the globe. By the 1970s, more businesses began using computers to encrypt communications. But distributing secret keys, needed to encode and decode messages, remained cryptology's greatest historical problem. Businesses had to physically fly couriers to dozens of distant offices to deliver the secret keys to avoid interception and to ensure absolute security. But key distribution was not cryptology's only problem. By the 1970s, some people were concerned about the growing code-breaking power of the government because of computer technology.
I think the biggest threat to privacy that we face is Moore's Law. It's the power of computing doubling every 18 months. The human population is not doubling every 18 months, but the ability for computers to keep track of us is.
Might as well add some shit
Surveillance technology
update.
with computers
I call
behind
it updating,
them
just like the
to analyze the surveillance data can give rise to an omniscient government. And it's not clear that democracy can survive on
Well,
this.
Sparman's overthrew the U.S. government.
By the mid-1970s, a trio of Stanford cryptographers, Whitfield Diffie, Martin Hellman, and Ralph Merkle, created a theoretical model for coded computer communications that eliminated the need for a secret distribution of keys. It also sought to offer powerful digital encryption to a perceived future of mass computer users as a counterweight to government spying. Called public key cryptography, it gave each computer user a pair of different but related keys, one public and one private. Now say Bob wants to send a secret message to Alice. Bob would use Alice's public key for encoding, but only Alice could use her private key to decode the message. No physical transportation of secret keys. And now, even Bob and Alice could theoretically have access to encrypted communications hidden from the most powerful investigative forces in government. Complete privacy.
None of the other developments in cryptography that I have seen, from the beginning of codes and ciphers themselves, has had the impact or has been as original a concept in cryptography as Whitfield Diffie's invention of public key cryptography.
Within a year, 3 MIT researchers, Ronald Rivest, Adi Shamir, and Leonard Adelman, created a series of mathematical equations using prime numbers that made Diffie's theory practical. As a side note, a group of 3 scientists, James Ellis, Malcolm Williamson, and Clifford Cox, working for Britain's government communications headquarters, apparently independently, invented public key cryptography by the mid-1970s, just before Whitfield Diffie. Their work was classified, and it wasn't until 1997 that public acknowledgement of their feat was recognized. As for the 3 MIT inventors, they formed RSA Data Security in 1982, the first company to commercialize public key cryptography and launch secure e-commerce.
The market we were going after in 1982 was the internet market. Okay, but we were so premature because it was to be 15 years later that the World Wide Web took off.
But the National Security Agency did notice and desperately tried to stop the spread of public cryptography. In 1986, the government stopped Lotus Development from exporting its software because it included RSA encryption. Then in 1993, the government investigated Phil Zimmermann for creating and distributing Pretty Good Privacy, a software that used RSA encryption over the internet. PGP could be used on anybody's personal computer, instead of just the giant machines used by the government and businesses.
There was a time when NSA
held a monopoly on this kind of technology. But over the past 20 years, that monopoly has eroded, and now academic cryptography has reached parity with the NSA. And PGP uses the best of the academic cryptographic algorithms and has made it available to the masses.
The National Security Agency was terrified that criminals were now accessing the world's most powerful, unbreakable encryption. The NSA believed PGP was severely compromising its code-breaking and intelligence-gathering abilities.
Many times I've been worried about if criminals and terrorists were to use this technology. And I did a lot of soul-searching on it. I sometimes lost sleep thinking about it. But individual governments like Stalin or Hitler have killed more people than all of the criminals of the 20th century combined, all over the world.
By 1994, RSA encryption was widely used in most U.S. software, and companies were pushing to export it. The government urgently sought a compromise by introducing the Clipper chip, a government chip that would be installed in communications devices. The chip, like a wiretap, could only be accessed by the government through a court order. Law enforcement could still eavesdrop on suspected criminals, but grant the public a level of privacy.
People were concerned that it was voluntary to start out with, but that it would become mandatory, that it would be pushed upon them. They were concerned about loss of personal privacy.
Do you want to control your private communications just by yourself, or do you want to be partners with the government in controlling your private communication? And ultimately, the society has decided that we want to keep privacy to ourselves.
After a 5-year fight and a huge public backlash to the proposal, the Clinton administration granted businesses the right to export public cryptography. By 1996, after MIT had published PGP in a book and posted it on its website, the government backed off its investigation of Zimmerman.
Even though government has intruded increasingly into private lives and has greater capacities these days to intercept communications, the growth of encryption has made it possible for individuals to protect themselves and protect their privacy in a way that had never been able to be done before.
You know, historically there's been a battle between cryptographers who make the codes and cryptanalysts who break the codes. And Edgar Allan Poe once said that any code that a man can invent, another man can break. But it turns out that that's probably incorrect. The best mathematical evidence we have is that that's not the case. In fact, code makers do win over code breakers.
Code breaking will last as long as people make mistakes. But the code systems themselves are getting better and better. They can't be broken now if properly used. So I think we're in an era of the slow death of the code breaker, much as I regret it in a way, and increasingly in the era of the code maker.
But throughout history, new codes have always been declared unbreakable, only to be eventually broken. As codes enter the realm of quantum computers, human ingenuity will be tested once again. Only time will tell the victors.
Yeah, only time will tell. Spawn, URGA, the cops, and the Reds, and the victors.
I am very honored and proud to present you Bill Binney on this stage, and he will be telling us the perspective from the inside of the NSA, because he was a technical director of the NSA for many years and worked in the intelligence services for more than 37 years. He is a child of the Cold War and worked throughout the Cold War, decrypting and breaking ciphers from the adversaries of the US. And back then he used to call himself the technical director of the world. in a sense. So, please give it away for How the NSA Tracks You with Bill Binney.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to say it's nice to be back with large numbers of people with character and integrity, which when I worked at NSA, not too many people had. If I was all looking at military and governmental encryptions and codes and activity. But the same techniques apply to any crypt system. I mean, it's not something that, and I was on the offensive side, not the defensive side. And I knew Snow and the defensive people, and I went to talk to them once about saying, here, I had all these solutions on the offensive side, and can you tell me how you're designing the defensive side? Because I thought that they should be parallel. You know, what we were doing, they were doing, and they wouldn't tell me. So that shows you the same kind of, there's that kind of communications now, like, for example, for cybersecurity, all the attacks that have come out of Vault 7 and the NSA exposures, hundreds of millions of lines of source code on attacks on firewalls, switches, servers, operating systems, all that. There's thousands of attacks, and we've only seen a few of them so far in the world, and you can just be ready for a much rougher ride. Because the offensive side knew all these things were weak and existing, the defensive side didn't, and they never fixed anything, so we were all vulnerable, so we all got attacked. And so now they say every time you get attacked, we need more money, more people, more empire. You know, so it's a swindle.
Well, fuck, I just want a house off the grid somewhere.
By our governments. If they would only fix the things they knew that were wrong, we might have some security.
They fuck over every customer.
So, but instead they don't. So at any rate, I didn't, when I left NSA, I did that at the end of October 2001 because they started spying on individuals and not groups of bad guys. Okay. So that meant they were scooping up everything from everybody in the world.
To finish paying if you went to
and it's much more extensive than anybody thought. It's more extensive than even the slides show. But because, and in order to store all this material, they had to build the Bluffdale 1 million square foot facility for storing data. And last year they broke ground for now a 2.8 million square foot facility on Fort Meade. It took out a 36-hole golf course to do it. So, I mean, the point is, if you collect everything, it's an ever-increasing amount of data year after year, which means you need ever-increasing data storage facilities to store it all. The way we found out about this was to look at every time the government wants to build something, they have to file an environmental study. So when they put in this very large building, they had to also submit an environmental impact statement and study to do it before they did it. So we're looking at those and seeing what they're building. So when they do that, well, this is on Fort Meade, and it's it's NSA doing it. So virtually everything on Fort Meade is NSA anyway. So that gave us the knowledge of the scale of what they're collecting and what they're assembling. For example, in Cisco, who sold them the routers to route data to the Utah facility,
and of course
estimated, there was a small article they wrote years ago that estimated that by 2015, the amount of data going into the Utah facility would be 966 exabytes.
I don't know what's going on out here, boy.
That's about a zettabyte. So that's why originally years ago I estimated that the capacity of Utah was about 5 zettabytes.
Try not to get brainwashed by me or anything.
I mean, it's my guess. You know, it's a lot of bytes. So, at any rate, I felt I didn't have to take anything with me because everybody in Congress, when I left, they knew what I was doing. Most of what they're doing to spy on everybody, I designed anyway or had a hand in it. So they knew all that. So I felt I didn't have to bring any material out to validate anything I was saying because they all knew I did it. So I naively thought that I could do that and go complain through the channels, the intelligence committees, and the inspector generals, and they would all take some action on it. Well, what it really meant was when it came time to actually hearing what I had to say, Congress never invited me in. I mean, I testified in the Bundestag, I testified in the House of Lords in the UK, but the Congress would never hear me because then they'd lose
Yeah,
plausible
whatever.
deniability.
The control say it's microwave hearing
That was
program.
really their key. They needed to have plausible deniability so
Yeah,
they
the
could
EMF
continue
showed
this
that works.
massive spying program because it gave them power over everybody. Everybody in the world, even the members of
That's why
Congress
they
had
say I
power
got a
against
dick
others.
cap
They had
on.
power on the judges in the Supreme Court, the federal judges, all of them. That's why they're so afraid. Everybody's afraid because all this data they had that about them, the central agencies, the intelligence agencies, they have it, and that's why Senator Schumer warned President Trump earlier, a few months ago, that he shouldn't attack the intelligence community because they've got 6 ways to Sunday to come at you. That's because it's like J. Edgar Hoover on super steroids. They have the same kind of data that J. Edgar Hoover had on everybody. So it's leveraged against every member of Parliament, every government of the world. When Edward Snowden came out, he came out with material and slides and publications by the government about the programs they were running. That gave me, and that was the stuff I left them, so it gave me all the opportunity to pull it together and say, this is what they're doing, this is how they're doing, this is what it means. And that's what I've been trying to do. So I assembled some slides to give you some idea, hopefully, a better idea of what's going on. And I also assembled some slides to show you what they should be doing. I have only one case of an unclassified version of big data analysis, which is what they should be doing, and they aren't. That's why people are getting killed. That's why I said in the UK
like
that bulk
everybody
data
around the
kills
world
people,
will be controlled by one
because
man.
all the analysts in the UK and MI5 and in GCHQ, similarly in the FBI and NSA,
hey, it ain't me.
they're buried in
down the
data and they
street.
can't see what's happening because it's and they're using the old techniques of word search.
I'm not the
and stuff.
Antichrist.
That-
They want
that's
to
not
try
the way to do it.
conquer the planet down
And
there.
social networking is the key to solving all of these problems, solving them
Spawn's been
quickly,
working on a
and
world
making all the
global
data
takeover for a while
content
now.
problem manageable. I'll take you into that. So here, these are the ways that
I don't give a
they
shit.
basically collect data.
Well, I
First,
just said, fuck it.
they
It's
use the
been a long
corporations
day.
that run the fiber optic lines, and they get them to allow them to put taps on them, and I'll show you some of the taps where they are. And if that doesn't work, they use the foreign government to go at their own telecommunications companies to do the similar thing. And if that doesn't work, they'll tap the line anywhere they can get to it, and they won't
Are
even
you
know
fucking
it.
kidding me?
The governments nor the communications companies will even know they're tapping.
What about the VAC?
So that's how they get into it. Then they get into the fiber lines, and this is the
radio
PRISM
fucking
program
torture
is really where they have the companies involved. That's down there, and a list of them. This came out. Was one of the first things that was published out of the Snowden material, and they were all focused on PRISM. Well, PRISM is really the minor program. I mean, the major program is upstream. That's where they have the fiber optic taps on hundreds of places around in the world. That's where they're collecting off the fiber line all the data and storing it. But PRISM was simply their way of putting out something where Congress and the courts could look at it and say, well, we're abiding by the law. See here, we asked these companies for this data, and we have a warrant for that to do it. So you see, we're abiding by the law. When in upstream, they were taking everything off the line. Also, the muscular program was a parallel one, which basically did the for Yahoo and Google and a couple others. They unilaterally tapped the lines between their data centers when they transferred data to back it up and so on. They got everything they had, and they didn't know it. And PRISM was only one small input to the data that NSA was collecting. Worldwide, these are the kinds of things they have. I mean, it's satellites, all kinds of collection.
The surveillance
The real
grid.
big one is over there at
global
CNE,
network.
Computer Network Exploitation. That's where they're implanting
I mean, it's
either,
hard to control
hardware
what you
or
say
software
or think if they can't
into switches
hear what
and
you hear in
servers
your
around the
home.
world,
It's
and they
spy.
can
You
make
gotta
them
be
do
able to
anything
spy
they
on
want
you.
because they
Be able to
own
do
them.
this shit, right?
So if you send data anywhere through those switches or servers, and there's tens of thousands of them in the world, they basically own the network. So all of that is feeding another program that they call Treasure Map. And this one just says, well, we want to know where
You
everything
get
is
a
in the
tinfoil hat
world
for your cell phone.
every minute of the day. So it's not just collecting what you're saying, encrypted or not, but it's also
I just decided to live stream
where
it.
you
It's
are
less
when you do
complicated
it.
that way. I ain't got nothing to hide here anyway.
And that's
I
basically
figure,
done by
let
this
everybody
is
hear how
kind
they
of
fuck with me on
the
a daily
geography of
basis.
the world, and there's the
Fuck
physical
it.
layout of the
Our business is
fibers and
shit
the
anyway.
microwaves
Don't
and
start
the
it,
satellite
don't
towers
stop
and everything. and then
classified,
that maps to
undisclosed until I
a physical
decide to
network,
fucking
and
do
then
it.
logical networks, who's communicating across them. That maps to the equipment, which in turn maps
I'll
to
have to
people, and that's how
move.
they follow everybody. This is also when
Go
you have
off the
cell phones, for
grid.
example, how they take GPS and use the drones to target people.
Have a bunker is EMF shielded.
I think Jacob Applebaum was the one who said the
so
NSA
now.
tracks them and CIA whacks them, right? And they do that. There's 1.2 million people on the drone list, according to the last number I saw. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, you know,
Hey, I didn't fucking say or think it. I just fucking laugh, and I'm like, yeah, that's what I get told when I say I'm going to go off the grid, moving a
I call
bunker,
that
right?
program random slaughter, because that's about what it is. And this is why I get in their face every time I possibly can in the U.S., because they're doing stupid stuff. It's hurting a lot of people. At any rate, that's the treasure map. All the material they collect from all the sources goes back into these programs, back inside NSA.
I do not believe there's a woman down the street that's in love with me, okay?
Square, fundamentally.
Am I supposed to believe that?
This was the entire design. These programs, Mainway and Marina, are basically the graphs of social networks that map into the databases of Pinwheel, the internet, and Nucleon, the voice. There are basically two systems they're following. Public switch telephone network, which is all the phones, fixed, mobile, satellite.
I'm 40 years old.
Any kind of phone. All the content data then goes into Nucleon, and it's indexed up there by the Marina program, so that when they want to see who did what, they have an index all to everything they ever said in their database. This was the whole design. I left them, and they haven't changed a damn thing in 15 years, 16 years. So that's real progress. At any rate, one of the things to look over here on the side is that both CIA and the FBI, through the FBI Center in Quantico, Virginia, have a direct access.
Well, why would the government give a fuck about me? Fuck.
Not only do that, but they also...
Especially when they spy on me and fucking use my intellectual property to build fucking
it's a straight violation of everything. All this data is collected without warrants, so... It's a basic violation of the rights of every human in a court.
They build time weapons without fucking warrants.
Arrest people, and then they pull a substitution.
Put your remote door monitoring.
And these are other people who have access to it. The Five Eyes group over here, they have direct access into the NSA database right here.
Well, it's cheaper for the government to spy on the scientists and fuck them over, steal his intellectual property, and build a fucking submarine and runs on
all
water.
All these people have direct access to all this data, and it's children's data as well. It's everybody on the line because they take it all. So it's nothing. There's no distinction. They don't filter anything. It's just everything. This is what General Alexander said in Menwith Hill Station a few years ago. He said, all we have to do is collect it all, and that's what they're doing. The problem is, once you collect it all, and they have the impression, or they give the impression, that data is intelligence, right? When you collect more data, you have more intelligence. It's not. The point is, you have intelligence when you understand the meaning of what you've collected. If you can't do that, I mean, you have nothing but a bunch of data. And that, unfortunately, that's the perspective they have. So they think collecting more is better.
I don't give a fuck about reading
what happens is it buries their analysts and buries both the police and the intelligence people, and they can't figure anything out. So, you know, what the consequences of planned attacks happen because they don't see them coming and they can't prevent them. And so that's why I said when I went to the UK to try to start
I'm not going to deal with the KGB.
I wanted to get them upset. I said, because they were getting ready to pass the investigative powers bill, the bulk acquisition of data on everybody in the UK as well as everybody they can possibly get in the world. I said bulk data kills people. And the reason I said that is because of the inability to stop terrorist attacks, for example. I mean, we continue to see these things today. I mean, nothing has changed. They're still going after more data, more people, more empire, and they still can't figure out what they've got. But they're really good after the fact. After the fact, once they know who did it, they've got all the data on them. They could go directly at them. The other thing it does give them, though, is the power to manipulate anybody they want, or do industrial espionage, or if somebody is getting a political group together or getting politically active and they don't want them, they have the ability to target them using this data. I mean, it's just there. All they have to do is go at it. So they can target people and use it against them. but they can't look at all of it to figure out who out there is planning an attack on us or is going to smuggle weapons or smuggle dope or any of that. They can't do that because they've got too much data. And they're using stupid searches like word searches. Well, you know, if they use the word bomb, you know, if they're looking at somebody planning a bomb or building a bomb, we could say, if you say in an email to anybody, well, you know, the quarterback threw a bomb at the last to win the game. Your email's going to be picked up by that word search, and it's absolutely irrelevant to anything they're looking for. That's the point. That's why social networking are focusing in on those networks that are involved in terrorism or the ones you know with the siege you had. I would point out that all of the terrorist attacks that have ever happened before or after 9/11 have been by people who were known by either the intelligence or the police or both. So why weren't they focusing on them? If they were, they may have a chance to prevent the attack. Instead, they're looking at this bulk stuff. I mean, it does spend a lot of money. It employs a lot of people, so it's what I call a happiness management program. But the point is that to keep it going, sometimes people have to die, and that's just that's un-American. First of all, you know, no American would do that. No one would sacrifice the lives of anybody for this crap, but they do, and they do it because there's a big empire behind this. I mean, to collect all this data, the intelligence community, mostly NSA, has spent somewhere close to $200 billion since 9/11 just to get the data. I mean, they've built an empire worldwide to do it, and they've got all these countries that are participating in that. So, and the closest are, of course, these here. I should point out that you see this date over here, down at the bottom right, 2032-018. That's the 8th day of January of 2032. That means it's the first classification review for this slide. 25 years. So if you subtract 25 years from that, it's the 8th of January of 2007 or 2007. That was the date the slide was created. So this was the state of things in 2007. Right? If you look at all these slides, you'll see many times I'll have a date there, and you can figure out, well, this is the date of that program, you know? So, at any rate, this is where they use the things for the rule of, for the SOD, that's the Special Operations Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The police, they have also the FBI, CIA, NSA, the DHS, the IRS, all have representatives on the SOD, and they all look into the NSA data. IRS is supposed to be there for fraud,
We're all
you know,
just going to be drooling vegetables, how they try to make us slaves,
and the FBI usually gets the
working for
Occupy
one
group,
man, I guess.
other political parties were attacked similarly, and of course people looking to unmask information about individuals, that's done in these kinds of organizations, you know, where they
Obviously,
can
I ain't got no
through
employees,
directly to
so
NSA.
it ain't going to
See,
be
the
me.
problem is a human failing here, is that
And I'm not a
people
follower.
given the power over others,
I'm not going to be
eventually
the
they use
leader of it. So
you know, that's historically true.
let's
It's a
go off
weakness
the
in
grid.
humanity. There's no checks and balances at all involved in this at all. The Congress says and the courts say they have oversight. That's a joke. Okay, they don't have any oversight. Even after the Snowden material came out, the head judge Reggie Walton on the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Relations Court, he came out and said, tried to make an excuse for his court and the judges on it, that they really didn't have a lot of capability of verifying anything that NSA, CIA, or FBI was telling them.
I know, yeah. They want to sign up Dan Moore in the middle of the night with Guy Williams.
He's totally dependent on them telling the truth. And they only tell him what they want to tell him. And the same is true with the intelligence committees in Congress. And the same is true in every country in the world.
I'm not going to be their truth
No country in the world, no
dictator,
government of any country in the world has any control of their intelligence. They do not know what they're doing. And they have no control of, really, of any of them. They can't stop it. They would say they go to oversight when they go in. All they're told is
that's like for everybody involved in this shit. I'm not just trying to
so they get the story du jour, the story of the day from that agency. That's the problem I see. But so in order to do this, you see, they don't tell any of the attorneys, the judges, or anything. You never sign anything, never put it in affidavits. There's no documentation that they used NSA data or NSA collected data from all their collaborators to do any of this. And so what that means is they have to do a parallel construction. They reconstruct data or go out and get data that they could substitute in a court of law for the NSA data, because then they could use that as a justification for the warrant, which they didn't get in the first place. So, but so that basically means they're perjuring themselves in a court of law. Now, this is not just for us in the United States. Anybody who has who has any relationship with the FBI or the DEA worldwide, they're all getting insight through these programs. And so whatever actions they take are based on the unconstitutional collection of data by the NSA and the CIA. But they're still using it. In fact, one of the federal agents using this data commented to a Reuters reporter. This is a Reuters slide.
Well,
he said, you know, this is such a great program. I just hope we can
Why
keep it
should he be a
secret.
fucking target for shit?
Well, what does that mean? It means we have a secret government, right? When you marry the intelligence agencies with the police, you have a secret police. Now in Germany, they call that the Gestapo or the Stasi.
Yeah.
So I refer to NSA as the new Stasi agency.
Or it could just be run by the KGB.
Unfortunately, that's, you know, we haven't been able to do anything. I am attempting to do everything I possibly can against these people, supporting 4 separate lawsuits against the President Trump, previously against President Obama, and the intelligence agencies of the United States for unconstitutional collection of data. We have to do it for our laws. Our Constitution governs violation of privacy rights of U.S. citizens, so we're attacking them that way in a court of law. And I just got my first chance with the Third Circuit Court of Appeals to submit some of this NSA data about their own programs into the court of law. Now, it's going to be tough for NSA to deny it because now it's in the federal courts. This is the court that's one level down from the Supreme Court in the United States. And it's at 4 separate circuit courts. One in the 2nd, one in the 3rd, one in the 9th, one in the 11th.
Yeah,
so I'm
the
coming
Fed
at
program's rolling
as
through.
many
I bet they
directions
got a
as
lot
I
of
possibly
miles.
can.
A lot of miles
And
on
hopefully one of them will
everything.
get through to the Supreme Court, and when it does,
Driving around.
we'll get to them. And if we fix it, I mean, and if we fix it, why, hopefully that'll spread around the world to the rest of the countries who've adopted this because we started it, okay? You know, we started it. We Americans were the first one in the bulk collection pit. The rest of you came along a little later. That's only because we were close in and it was convenient, you know, so we got it first. At any rate, the point is they're all doing the wrong thing for 2 basic reasons. Number one, it buries their analysts with too much data, so it makes them totally dysfunctional. They can't figure out anything, and they're just losing it. And by the way, I provided from Edward Snowden's material copies of memos written by internal analysts in NSA and MI5 and various other places, saying that they are buried in data. They just can't figure out anything. They've got too much data. Well, I gave that to all to the House of Lords as documentation of what I was saying was true, and they simply ignored it. But the main problem I had from the very beginning was it was a total invasion of the privacy rights of everybody on the planet, starting with us in the U.S. I mean, they were using the programs that were developed in the SIGINT Automation Research Center, which I was founder of, and the people I had building those things were the ones they had to depend on to implement them worldwide on a scale that is still growing. There's no limitation to the scale.
Is that what they said?
We did B+3 type flat file indexing schemes, which meant if you needed more space, you simply added another server, spread out the graph, you know. And so we saw no limit to anything we could do. I mean, we'd already taken in trillions of transactions, and that wasn't a problem at all. Once I found out that they started taking in everything that the telecommunications companies were having in terms of U.S. communications, principally starting with the public switch telephone network, and then starting very shortly after that, the internet and basically the World Wide Web. It took me. I found that out in the 2nd week of October 2001, and it took me a week and a half to get out of the place. So I got out Halloween Day, 31st of October 2001. And since then, I've been trying to advocate internally in the intelligence committees and the inspector generals of both Department of Justice and Department of Defense, to have them. I mean, obviously this is totally unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Penn Register Law, Electronic Privacy Act, Electronic Security Act, any of the laws in place to cover FCC regulations governing any of the telecoms. That's why the telecommunications companies had to get retroactive immunity in 2008, because they had so many laws that they were violating every day. And you know, they're still doing that. So the point was that they were all in it together, and each one of the committees and the courts had to protect one another. It was a cover-up because they were all involved in this. And the White House was the starter. It was actually started by Darth Cheney. I call him Darth Cheney because he went to the dark side. That's what he said, anyway. So at any rate, in the meantime, we had been advocating for a targeted approach where you went after groups of people that were doing bad things, and you could easily define it by social networks in the world, either in the public switch telephone net or in the internet. We had no difficulty doing that at line speeds, fiber optic rates. We were able to sessionize fiber optic rates at STEM level transmissions in 1998. So from there on, we were able to do deep packet inspection on all that stuff, reconstruct everything on the lines, and so we were able to see networks, and we built all these social networks using the routing data, the IPs, and the addressing schemes of the internet as well as the phone network, and we had no difficulty doing a targeted approach then of using that data to filter out what was relevant to targets we were interested in or should be interested in out of the flow of information around the world at whatever rate they were doing it. We simply subdivided and conquered it by the divide and conquer approach. That was our way of doing it, and our targeting approach. We even took the Customs and Border Protection after we left NSA. And one of the ways we did that, I mean, this is the only unclassified version I could take of big data, okay? It's the only thing I have. So we went down there, and we had a Bureau of Industrial Security up there, the Commerce Department, published this alert because some military in Iraq overran the bomb making factory, and they found some parts in there, and they looked at the parts, they saw the part numbers, and I think they traced the part numbers back to companies in the U.S. selling them to Iranian companies in Dubai. Now, the reason they located in Dubai, because it's outside of Iran, it's outside of the exclusionary trade, so they operating out of Dubai, they could order these parts, you know. So the Bureau of Industrial Security had to alert everybody in the world that this was going on. So we took that and used Google and went on the web.
Yeah, the police department.
The data they had. So, but we used it and went onto the web and Googled all the things and started looking at the data. This was also given, continued. Now, at any rate, what we did was we went out, we added all kinds of information to that, looking at, we added fax numbers, phone numbers, addresses, more data on people involved, and more company names involved. And then at the end of it, just before, after the BIS report came out, they once that was out, they took all the names of the companies they had off the web, and then kept that data out of the way, because then they thought that BIS and Customs and Border Protection were still looking for the old data. They didn't have that confirmed, so they removed it. And they changed the names. So in the process of changing it, they used one of the new numbers, phone numbers, with some of the old data. So that gave us the end, and we then traced all to the new data they went. And as they went, we followed them, but we didn't lose a thing. Of course, the Customs and Border Protection and the Pentagon and various other people in the intelligence, they did lose it. But we used Google and followed it. So we provided all that data to them, and since we didn't trust the U.S. government to do the right thing, we also gave it to our counterparts in Canada, because they were losing people from IED attacks too. So we didn't trust our government to do the right thing, so we passed it up there too. They, of course,
see the little teddy bear waving down
we
there?
didn't, of course. But the whole idea was we compiled all this list of information that we got from them and from those approaches, and gave it to Colonel Woody at the Pentagon. He was the group that was looking at the IED, prevention of IED attacks and so on. So we passed all this data down to try to cut the supply of the parts going into them. The reason they used multiple company names to do the construction of the IEDs is because each company would order a different part. And the idea was that if the Customs and Border Protection looked at a given company, which is the way they do it, they would only see one part of an IED and never deduce that they were putting together an IED. So unless you collapse them down by a common attribute, like they're all sharing the same phone number, or they're all sharing the same address, or something like that, to put these multiple companies into one place where you see the whole activity, then you sum it all together by their names and you see the IEDs. So you can see what they're doing when you do that. And so we proposed to Customs and Border Protection that we do this for them. They had a small data set of about 500 million records over 10 years.
Then the silver car comes and this little girl's
So it was like
again
one
down the
import
street.
could be 1,000 cars on a ship, you know. So it was like 500 million records. That, and they said it was a real mess because the data was dirty and all that. We looked at it, thought it was a gold
Are
mine.
these silver
There's all
vehicles
kinds
from
of
the
information here,
Naval
phone
Air
numbers on
Station,
addresses,
or
so on. We could lay out the entire, all the entire world's phone numbering schemes and how they change as they change since they took these things out there. So we proposed to them that we scrape the entire world's websites and pull together a consolidated list of however many million companies there were in the world, 1 to 200 million, something like that, and be able to do a collapse on this and study all those and find those who were showing attributes of doing something illegal, which is what this multi-addressing scheme implies. So that would define a set of suspicion, zones of suspicion for companies involved in the world trade. And we estimated that from our study that we scraped the entire website. The Pars Guide was the website in Dubai, listing all the Iranian companies in Dubai. There were 5,032 of them. And when we did that, we found 222 different company names that subgrouped into 55 different groups that were doing different nefarious things for the Iranian government, like smuggling dope, weapons, that kind of thing.
Yeah, is that what Affordable
Getting
Wind Turbine
buying
is doing? Because you
equipment
drove
for
by in your silver
IEDs
car and you want
and
to
looking
modify
around
shit
for
with
things
microwave
like
hearing
that would
and
help them with
record it
triggers and
and
nuclear
live on
stuff.
the internet?
So we passed all that along.
Yeah,
too.
they don't
Of
care
course,
because
our
I ain't
government
getting a license
is
plate
too dense
supposedly. They think this
to really
camera
do
up
anything.
front's
So once
the one I
we
have.
did that, we said we'd estimated that the entire world would produce perhaps 40,000 targets for you to do targeted selection of searching of incoming crates and imports and don't do exports to these companies. So we thought we could
Yeah,
do
the
that
place
in
on
the
Cliff
first
Road in
run of
Amelia,
our
I'm
data,
sure
and it would
feels
take us
hard to
6
do,
months
just
to
like
correct
my
all the
place
data and make that happen.
down the
With
street down
Craig
here.
Wiebe, myself, and 2 programmers. But that was too cheap, you see. They wanted to let a $1.2 billion contract to IBM to do it, so they fired us, brought in IBM. So, and they still haven't done this, by the way.
I wish I had $2 billion.
So,
I'd probably
the
move off the
ultimately
planet.
thing that came out was they indicted
Yeah, that's what
everybody who was
Elon
involved
Musk
in
is
all
playing
this.
as, move
They
to
arrested
Mars.
a few of them in Florida, but some of them were back in Iran,
Sanctuary
so they
from
couldn't
the
get to
Earth's
them.
mind
But
control.
they left the indictment out
20.
there. But it took them 2 years
29.
to do the indictment from
That'd be a good
the
science
time
fiction
that we
movie.
found all the data. That's a really fast judicial process. So, but this was something they could do worldwide on everything, every possible criminal activity in the world by looking at that social networks, looking at targeting approach, which would give everybody privacy. If you use that as a filter right up front, nobody's data gets taken in unless they are a part of a criminal activity or falling into a zone of suspicion around that activity. So it would give everybody in the world privacy. But that's not what they wanted. They didn't want privacy. They first removed our filter up front so they could take in everything. And they took away all the encryption we used to give privacy to people once we took the data in until we had a warrant. And they removed that. And then they removed the auditing routine in the back that looked at everybody that came in and what they did, when they came there, where they went, what data they looked at, what they did with the data. And they removed that because they didn't want anybody to know what they were going to do. They didn't even want internally anybody to know. So it's not just that they're keeping secrets from us, they're keeping secrets from Congress and everybody else, even people inside their agency. Because the vast majority don't know. I think there's only about 3,000 people now inside NSA that really are involved in one way or another or know direct evidence about this program. So that's the sick part of it. You know, this is like a secret democracy that's not a real democracy. I mean, Goethe said it pretty well. He said no one is more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they're free.
David William
And
X-ray
that's us.
5003.
So anyway, I have this little thing here. Try to get it out of the way. I hope you can see it. I can't see it. What's this thing doing here? Well, we have more details about our startup soon. Kirk and I are in Europe because we can't get anything done in the U.S. So we're going to get done. We're going to advise anybody, any organization, government.
I wish my building was like an NSA
privacy
building.
and security by design.
Shielded windows,
we're going to
shielded
help
roof,
get one of those capabilities
no radio interference.
up and running here in
to modify
Europe
what I
somewhere,
hear.
because obviously the US and the UK are too dense to realize it can be done. Actually, it's their agenda is the one that's driving them. This
Yeah, I
one
bet those
is
NSA
money,
employees
power, and
love
control.
being at work
And the
all
way you
day.
get that is to
They
take in
probably
data
hate
on
going home
everybody
when they
on the
don't have
planet.
gold-plated windows, right?
And that gives you that power. Then you can swindle money
Actually, I
because
think it's
you can let
confirmation.
things happen because of the way you're doing business. Things happen, and that's more justification. Get more money to. It's like a swindle. I called the terrorism thing of trading privacy for security a lie from the beginning, and that's just the way they swindled everybody. Because when the way they took in all the data, that meant they couldn't stop anything. That meant more people get killed. They say they need more money, more people, more bureaucracy to stop it. They'd get that, and more people get killed by another attack because they get too much data, and they keep dumping more and more on people. It's just they're perpetuating the same problem. They're not facing the issues. They don't realize what the problem really is, and people are dying as a result.
Yeah,
So
there's probably
we're over here
using
trying
a
to do
huge
something
surveillance
about that,
apparatus.
and hopefully we
The
will
United
get
States
there.
has built a brainwash.
I have another slide here, right? No? Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. One question comes to mind. Being the technical director that you were, how did you end up noticing this rather than approving that or knowing of all that from the very beginning?
Well, see, as a technical director, I was looking at what is the biggest problem that the analysts in the NSA had to solving problems and predicting the intentions and capabilities of people who are going to hurt people or criminal activity. And it turned out to be the digital explosion of communications, cell phones, internet, and so on. So I had to design a way of getting into it, but it was pretty clear that in order to do that, we would be violating everybody's privacy unless we did something to eliminate that. So that's why I built in a social targeting and pulling out only that information, letting everything else go by. And that design was one of the things they didn't want. They wanted to take in everything, so they wanted to get rid of that
Yeah, our
filter.
neighborhood's pretty antisocial.
See, in order for NSA to put that into place and get it running, they had to use the same contractors that I did to have my program built, because they're the only ones who knew how to put it together and get it up and running. Nobody else in NSA did. And they had no other programs that could handle the massive amounts of data, so they had to use my programs. When they did that, some of them came to me and said, you know what they're doing? And he said they're taking in all this data on U.S. citizens down the hall from us and building these graphs and everything and just doing analyzing and violating the privacy of everybody in the United States. Then, of course, after that, it spread to everybody in the world. But that's how I found out about it. And once I did that, that was the first sign to me I had to get out of here. I knew no one would do that in NSA without approval from above, and that came directly out of Darth Cheney's office.
Question, the filtering and the targeting of social networks needs a lot of data, and then you can extract patterns, and then you can throw away the data because you don't need it anymore. Is that right?
Well, you can see if you there's a couple of ways to do it. One, if you have a seed that is, a bad guy, you could look at his social network and build from that. And then you could say 1 degree beyond that is as far as I'll go to pull data in. It really ends up 2 degrees from the bad guy, but you only pull data in from 1 degree from him. And so that means that you're focused All the rest of the world's data goes right by, and that's what you pull. And the metadata is the way you pull it out, because that gives you the ability to, I mean, you're looking at the data that's required for the network to route data. And if you do that, then it's easy to pull all that data out, and that's all you really get. And it gives people privacy, and you get a rich environment for your analysts to succeed. That's what they don't understand.
I'm still curious, how can you get patterns from things you have never seen before?
Because
the unexpected.
We used actually 2 approaches out of 3, but it was deductive, inductive, and abductive approach. The deductive approach simply said it's dealing with the graph. If you're in the graph and you're close to, within proximity of 2 hops of a known terrorist, then you're going to be in a zone of suspicion. You'll be looked at. It doesn't mean you're guilty. It just means you're going to be looked at. And then a decision will be made, yes or no. If yes, then...
When I complain about the program, I get looked at.
Then the entire
people come steal my shit.
Shift.
I get beat up.
If you become a target at that point, you see. So and that was done by software. The other was the inductive approach, was the main one. That is, if you are looking at sites advocating pedophilia, or sites advocating jihad or terrorist activities or violence against the West,
people,
and you keep repeatedly looking at them, you look at multiple sites advocating them.
Yeah, they keep rerunning tapes of the surveillance apparatus.
And they fall into zone of suspicion, and that means you get looked at. So at that point, you get the data coming in, but you can do it all having all their attributes encrypted until you can prove.
I have data coming in regardless when I call the FBI.
Last question: isn't it handy that they do have a lot of data about the White House? People are now in the White House.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they have everything they do, including the codes to decrypt their communication.
Hello. You mentioned the immense capacity to store all this data from everyone, and I was wondering in what companies and did they cooperate willingly to create such a capacity to store all the data, and in particular IBM. And so can we still trust our servers? And
no, it's every one of them, and no. Because in the United States, if you're a company in the United States, they can force you by law to give them their data. It's only now coming out. I mean, the business, they call it the business records requisition. The first thing from Edward was the general warrant by the Verizon company to turn over all the
still got a backdoor
about their customers, over 110 million U.S. citizens. You know?
Obviously, they're not going to. They say they can't fix it. They're not going to fix it.
Direct violation. That's why.
That's why I went with the AV thread ripper. They ain't got a backdoor for it.
But they have the power to do that with all of the companies, and I would point out that that was BR 13-80, which meant it's the 80th order of 2013 to companies to give business records, which is the second quarter, and it's issued every 90 days. So every quarter, an order comes out to each individual company. So. The way I reckoned in the public switch telephone network, the first 2 companies in line in the network providing data were AT&T and Verizon. So Verizon would get, AT&T would get order 1 in quarter 1, Verizon gets order 2 in quarter 1, and then it gets order 80 in quarter 2. That means there's 78 companies participating. So that's 78 companies participating, banks, telecommunications company, ISPs on the internet, and so on.
So did they get anything in exchange for all the information they passed on to the NSA?
Yeah, money. They get
all
paid
business.
for it. They get paid for it. Yeah. There's a whole schedule on a whole schedule on the rate of how much they get paid. It's true.
Thank you for being here and everything you've done for basically all of us. My question is, when you see these testimonies from, for example, James Clapper, Keith Alexander, when they're being asked directly, are you monitoring? You can kind of see in their eyes, and when you read other press, that monitoring means a complete thing for people within the NSA. So my question is, how do we make questions more relevant to level the playing fields to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing?
Well, it's hard, especially when they lie to you. I mean,
Yes.
What can you, not wittingly, but
But how do we make the questions sharper. When we say, okay, we know when we say monitoring,
okay.
then...
Yeah, here's how Senator Wyden phrased the question properly, I think is what you're getting. He asked General Alexander how many U.S. citizens does he have in his databases? That's the right question. It's not, if you talk about collection, well, Alexander, he uses a word game. Collection means somebody looking at it at NSA. So it's not collected until somebody looks at it. Well, that's horseshit, If I collect all your data, I've got it in my database. So he asked the right question. How many do you have in your database? Well, it came back, he said he couldn't answer him, so he came back in writing. This is on the web, if you want to go look at it. It's really a joke. He says, we cannot tell you that because it would be a violation of the privacy rights of U.S. citizens. This is...
Hi, as an American, I'd like to say thank you for your service. And I also wanted to ask, as a citizen, if there's anything we can do to make it easier for agents to blow the whistle or to encourage them to become whistleblowers.
Well, I always advocate the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So complain, bitch, moan, brag, groan. If your congressman or senator comes out for a town meeting, confront them with it. Why are you backing this? This is obviously unconstitutional. You're violating your oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution, and what are you going to do about it, or should I work for somebody else? And if you aren't going to stop this, I'm going to work against you, give my money to somebody else, and vote to fire you. And otherwise sue the bastard. That's what I'm doing.
Do you see a cultural change within the NSA, that there may be more people who stand up and, choose different paths, to choose to reform the NSA from inside, or is that...
Yeah, I think that's probably happening, especially with the younger generation going into NSA. The older generation, we did a Myers-Briggs study of personal traits of people working at NSA in 1992 or something like that. And it turned out that 85% of them were ISTJs. So they're all introverts. It's like these are the people who like to work in their desks, Mathematicians are that way. They're very quiet people. Give me a pencil, I'll put it down. Where is the answer, That's all they do. But they're very easy to threaten. Those are the kind of people you can easily threaten. So that's what's been going on inside NSA. They have a program now called See Something, Say Something about your fellow workers. Well, that's what the Stasi did, That's why I call them the Stasi, New Stasi, They're picking up all the techniques from the Stasi and the KGB and the Gestapo and the SS. They just aren't getting violent yet that we know of, okay? Internally in the U.S., outside is another story.
Now we know something about the U.S. programs, but do we know something about the other nations like Russia? We know that China has some internal spying program, but do they have capabilities of external spying?
Yes. These are the countries participating with NSA. Of course, the rest of the Five Eyes up there, and then everybody else is classified as third parties except for fourth parties, which we don't talk about because we don't want anybody to we have relations with them. So, they're off the board. But these are the countries, and each country has a different relationship with NSA. I think 8 or 9 of these countries in the third-party category are cooperating in the bulk acquisition of data on the Internet with NSA and GCHQ and the rest of the Five Eyes.
The big one missing there is Russia, so we should suppose that Russia has some similar secret programs, or...
Well, Russia does the same thing in reverse, they're looking at us the same way, Everybody's doing this, to the ability and the capabilities that they have. This is standard spying. That's why diplomacy was created, so we can spy on people.
Would you say that the way that they are doing the wrong thing is incapabilities or not willing to do the right thing?
Yeah, they are capable. You can see some of these whistleblowers still coming out. There are people who understand they're doing the wrong thing, and they could create a way to do it, like I did internally. The trouble is you have people managing these agencies who are fundamentally corrupt because there's so much money involved in this. Money corrupts, and it's just... the budget for NSA is like $16 billion a year, and for the entire intelligence community, it's been close to $1 trillion since 9/11. So that's a lot of money, and there's a whole empire, intelligence empire that's built up over the years in the United States and also in the UK, and it's spreading. I mean, some of the testimony from BND and what they're doing with NSA, the Bundestag has found out recently about many of the things they're doing. So they're all doing the wrong thing in terms of looking to stop things, really. They're not taking a targeted approach. That's a professional, disciplined look at your job and the target you're supposed to be looking at and watching, instead of looking at everybody, spreading your effort across the entire planet.
How is it possible that we still have organized crime on a global scale, some of this outside of the power of the United States, of the direct influence? At least I would imagine organized crime from foreign countries should be the subject of this kind of information. Is it used and we don't know, or is it not used and why?
I would say they attempt to use it, but if you look at if you Google X-keyscore, which is the query routine going into the databases for most of the people, or IC Reach, I don't know that most of that's out there yet, but if you looked at that and you could see the way they ask the queries, it's about putting in words and phrases, and just like you do in a Google search. So in a Google search, you get tons of material back, so that approach gets you tons of material, which means you've got to go through all the items to try to find it. And where is it in this list of, say you get 100,000 items back, where is it? Is it 90,000, 80? Can you get there? No. The answer is no. That's why they were failing.
So you're saying they're failing because they're not able to interpret the data?
That's exactly right. They can't figure out what they've got.
Oh, how come you are able to be here? Why aren't you dead, or at least in jail for something wrong you said, or if they've got so much power over everybody?
Well, as I said in the movie about Me, A Good American, I said, if they ever do anything like that, everyone will know who did it and why. So they don't want to expose themselves to that kind of political and reaction by the public in the United States, because and now I'm basically well known around the world, so I don't think I want to get them in court any way I can. If they want to do that, that's one of the ways, at least if they don't terminate me, I'll be able to do that.
So basically, by making it obvious they're your enemy, you're safe.
Public exposure to a degree is security.
Okay.
Yes.
Please give a warm round of applause.
Okay. Thank you.
The United States was on the verge of dissolution on March 9, 1861, when Abraham Lincoln arrived in Washington, D.C. for his first inaugural address. The states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida had all voted to secede from the Union, and Texas's governor had been overthrown for refusing to secede. The departing administration of President James Buchanan had bankrupted the Treasury, while his Secretary of War, John Floyd, had secretly shifted Union armaments to Point South to arm the intended insurrection. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, was surrounded by armed secessionists ready to strike, and an assassination plot against Lincoln was planned, along with a plot to disrupt the official counting of the Electoral College ballots in the capital. General Winfield Scott, a hero in the War of 1812, took measures to secure the capital with thousands of federal troops.
Any man who attempted by force to obstruct or interfere with the lawful count of the electoral vote should be lashed to the muzzle of a 12-pound gun and fired out of a window of the Capitol. I would manure the hills of Arlington with fragments of his body, but me a senator or chief magistrate of my native state. It is my duty to suppress insurrection. My duty.
This siege of the Capitol and coming war was for Lincoln not merely a conflict between the North and the South, but a world war against the British Empire. Lincoln knew the British Empire viewed the U.S. government, founded on the principle that all men are created equal, as a threat to the continuation of their empire. Lincoln also knew that the British Empire had not only steered the development of the present secession, but had organized continuous secession movements to break up the Union since the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary and founder of the American system of economics, was assassinated in 1804 by Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States. At the same time, Burr organized a military insurrection against the government to create a separate nation composed of the vast Louisiana Territory and part of Mexico. The design, funding, and brashness of Burr's operation were not his own.
I have just received an offer from Mr. Burr, the actual Vice President of the United States, to lend his assistance to His Majesty's government in any matter in which they may think fit to employ him, particularly in endeavoring to effect a separation of the western part of the United States from that which lies between the Atlantic and the mountains, in its whole extent.
The British government which deployed Burr burned the capital to the ground 8 years later in the War of 1812, and organized a secession movement of the New England states, a system driven by the British East India Company and its Secret Intelligence Service Director, Lord Shelburne. As the United States defeated these various attacks, Shelburne's successor and protege, Lord Palmerston, turned to the British slave system in the southern U.S. as the new axe to chop apart the United States. The slavery system, destroying the southern United States, was a critical part of a worldwide British economic system to which Adam Smith gave the name free trade. Beginning in West Africa, the British East India Company, Royal Africa Company, and others captured slaves. These slaves were shipped to the Western Hemisphere to create the slave plantation system of the southern United States. The principal product of this system in the 19th century was cotton, 75% of which was exported to England. Here, English peasants worked for shillings to turn the cotton into low-quality textiles, which were then sold in India, the crown jewel of the empire. The Indian subjects, denied the right by the British to produce for themselves, paid for the textiles with opium crops. The Indian opium was then shipped from India to China, where it was forced on the Chinese people for enormous profits, addicting millions to the life-sucking drug. The profits from this cycle, characterized by East India Company lackey Adam Smith as buying cheap and selling dear, was the foundation of the empire's existence. An interruption of any one part was an interruption to the whole.
In dealing with vulgar-minded bullies, and such unfortunately the people of the United States are, nothing is gained by submission to insult. The U.S. have no navy which we need to be afraid, and they might be told that if they were to resort to privateering, we should, however reluctantly, be obliged to retaliate by burning all their seacoast towns.
Palmerston never gave up the hope that the United States could be broken apart, could destroy the American system. And so Lord Palmerston was naturally a supporter of the Confederacy. In fact, he wrote a letter, January 1st, 1861, to Queen Victoria, praising the British and French troops taking of Peking at that time. And then he said, we also are on the verge of the dissolution of the United States. And this was good news for Britain.
When Lincoln was elected in November 1860, the British had recently conducted war against Russia in 1854 and against China in 1859, when the Chinese attempted to block the smuggling of opium into their ports. Now, in 1861, a great war was imminent, pivoted on whether the British or the American system would prevail in the Western Hemisphere.
Lincoln knew that he was going into a war. The key of Lincoln, the character of Lincoln, going into the inauguration and through his presidency, he was on the front lines of a war against the British Empire. And he knew it. He was being shot at. Eventually, obviously, he was assassinated. But there were many attempts against him, as if he was a soldier in the battle. But it was his ideas, it was his mind, which drove the victory over the South. That was why he was the #1 target. In Lincoln, because of the nature of the conflict over slavery, he very much always came back to the Declaration of Independence. That this, for I think any of the great figures in the United States, the Declaration and the Constitution are one piece. So Lincoln rested on all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are inalienable rights. And they are embedded in every individual human being, that there is no difference.
On his trip to Washington for the inauguration, Lincoln was notified of an assassination plot laid for him at a scheduled stop in Baltimore, Maryland.
Now, when he passed through Philadelphia, after having been informed of this plot, he stood right here on this spot and participated in a flag-raising ceremony on the morning of February 22nd, 1861.
I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. I have often pondered over the dangers which were incurred by the men who assembled here and adopted that Declaration of Independence. I have pondered over the toils that were endured by the officers and soldiers of the Army who achieved that independence. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that kept this Confederacy so long together. It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but something in that declaration giving liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weight should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. This is the sentiment embodied in that Declaration of Independence. Now, my friends, can this country be saved upon that basis? If it can, I will consider myself one of the happiest men in the world if I can help to save it. If it can't be saved upon that principle, it will truly be awful. But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I was about to say, I would rather be assassinated on this spot than to surrender.
Lincoln is very much an example of a fully conscious figure of history.
What did I just fucking hear?
That he is acting as a figure of history. His motive is that. His immediate predecessor, there are many predecessors to Lincoln's thought. And in a case like his, there are always things that you may overlook were to report. But the key thing is, his impetus, which led to his presidency, was John Quincy Adams. The policy was, we have a Canadian border, we have a Mexican border, we have an Atlantic Ocean, we have a Pacific Ocean. These are our borders. This is our nation. We have to do nothing for this nation in this area. Our destiny is to begin with that. Destiny is to cross the Pacific. As the numbers cross the Atlantic, we must cross the Pacific to liberate the people on the other side of the Pacific. Get them engaged with them.
William 190.
And our partner against the European Union. That's it. When he said about the new Lincoln represented upon his election, they had to stop him from being in the Senate. So, Herod itself, there was Mary Lincoln passed his election. There was an enormous riot plan that was supposed to go off, trigger a certain amount of chaos, and there were plans
universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. Descending from these general principles, we find the proposition that in legal contemplation, the Union is perpetual, confirmed by the history of the Union itself. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. It was matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It was further matured in the faith of all the then 13 states expressly plighted and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation in 1778. And finally, in 1787, one of the declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. But if destruction of the Union by one or by part only of the states be lawfully possible, the Union is less perfect than before the Constitution, having lost the vital element of perpetuity. It follows from these views that no state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances.
1 month after Lincoln's inauguration, the Southern Rebellion began. The Confederate Army received huge support from Palmerston's British Empire throughout the war. However, Lincoln defeated the Confederacy by reviving the superior moral principle and industrial might of the nation. Even amidst civil war, Lincoln advanced the unity of the United States, as with his launching of a transcontinental rail project and encouragement of settlement by immigrants of lands west of the Mississippi. 2 days after the surrender of the Confederacy in April of 1865, Lincoln spoke on his policy for bringing the South back into the Union as if they had never left. Only 3 days after that, Lincoln was assassinated. The trigger man, John Wilkes Booth, was no longer known. Booth had been recruited to the assassination plot years earlier through a nest of Palmerston agents in British Canada, such as George Sanders, a paid operative of the British Empire's Hudson Bay Company, and John Surratt, a regular agent of the London-based Confederate Secret Service. The federal government itself identified this, convicting 8 people and hanging 4 on the charge of conspiring with these and other agents harbored in British Canada. However, these principal British agents, such as Surratt and Sanders, although wanted by the federal government, fled to safety in Great Britain. The Lincoln murder was a desperate British reaction to the defeat of their century-long strategy for dissolution of the United States. But instead of the United States dissolving into chaos, Lincoln's ideas became more powerful through his death. Because of Lincoln, the transcontinental unity of the nation will be achieved a few short years later. But also the living power of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence emerged over empire as a power in the world. In the eyes of foreign nations, the young United States, previously only a daring experiment in law and government, now had validated its principles. To individuals like Henry C. Terry, who was Lincoln's economic advisor, the United States underwent the most rapid industrialization and economic growth of history that humanity has ever seen. This development was driven by economic policies explicitly against British free trade, such as the highest tariffs in history of the U.S. These tariffs banished the British Empire's cheap, slave-laden goods from American markets, allowing manufacturing, infrastructure building, and population growth to steam ahead.
bring in British free trade. What's left? Destruction.
Protecting the development of your population, your core capabilities, agriculture, industry, and so on. That's protectionism. So when you look at this, no country has ever developed without protection. None. Not any country in Europe, not anywhere.
On May 10, 1869, the last spike in the transcontinental line was driven. For the first time, the historic mission of the U.S. project was met. A nation unified for manufacturing and infrastructure from east to west, north to south.
Think about this. This is after a 4-year-long civil war, tearing apart the United States. Half a million human beings killed. An equivalent number, a huge amount wounded, maimed for life. You'd think that the nation would have been crippled for a long time to come after this, as the British intended. This nation came out of the Civil War with a type of unity and a type of economic development that the world has never seen. We became a world's leading power economically within 10 years, 15 years of the Civil War.
In 1876, Henry Carey organized the U.S. Centennial Celebration, inviting the world to see how Republican principles had transformed the youngest nation on earth into the most prosperous. 9 million visitors attended, including official foreign delegations composed of scientists, engineers, economists, and industrialists. What these observers saw was the opening of an incredibly vast new field of human potential, such as had never existed in the world before that point. Amidst the awesome array of drill presses, saws, printers, water tanks, and more, sat Henry Carey's literature stand of books and pamphlets, educating visitors on the virtues of the American system of economics. The American system of economics values the creative powers of the human individual far above any other form of material wealth. Further, it recognizes these creative powers as the very source of that material wealth. While the British Empire fights for control of the so-called natural resources of the environment, the American system's power comes simply by the recognition that the nature of the human species was to be the one living creature on the planet which had no natural resources outside of its members' own sovereign ability to create them.
All creation is a mind, and every man a miner. In the beginning, the mind was unopened, and the miner stood naked and knowledgeless upon it. Fishes, birds, beasts, and creeping things are not miners, but feeders and lodgers merely. Beavers build houses, but they build them in no wise differently, or better now, than they did 5,000 years ago. Man is not the only animal who lives, but he is the only one who improves his workmanship. This improvement he effects by discovery and invention.
That's the entire experience of a person, mankind. You're directly related to ideas. Because of that, you become the only interface for ideas to manifest themselves in physical reality. To make a discovered principle, a discovered something that exists that's true in the universe, and then to force the physical universe to respond to that invisible principle, to respond to that idea.
The human economy exists within a universe organized by this dynamic ability of man to willfully change nature.
You have to ask yourself what's required for that spread, that texture, that growth of humanity into these areas. What's required? There are certain things you need to spread. You need water, you need food, some similar things to plant and animal life. But the human species need the ability to creatively introduce those things yourself, such as, for instance, irrigation. The human species, if you want to introduce human life into the desert, we don't wait for water to appear in the desert. We irrigate the desert.
The source of that is in the individual, lies in the individual as opposed to collective processes. What it requires is that you individuals in your society who have been educated up to the level where they're able to contribute something of their own.
A discovery we make in nature usually involves something that's already happening. But we make a discovery of how that's happening. Now we turn that discovery we've made into a way of changing nature by our acting on use of that physics. We have a power the animals. This is what we call incorporated theory. You're going to discover universal principles and use these to change nature. All of our time. No animal
to create something entirely new, something original to the entire course of what's been discovered so far in the course of humanity. That capacity exists in every single human individual. And the idea that
Nathan fucking did his sunset out here because it's so fucked up. Yeah, it's fucked up. That's why I don't go anywhere anymore.
In opposition to the British Empire treats the power of human insight as a threat to its power. With empire there is no divine spark of human reason which profoundly transforms nature. With empire, man is only a different form of category. Thus, the order
I got a pile of fucking shit out there, so I gotta figure this out place. I don't know how I'm gonna get down. Fucking trust leaving the fucking house anymore. All these people trying to steal my shit. Fucking burn the place down, blah blah blah. Just fucked. That's all they do is have you fucking paranoid. Paranoid living.
Direct product of the fact that you get a slave society is incapable.
The CIA. What the CIA said I can't go back?
In the Centennial Convention, teams of American military engineers, economists, and diplomats carried the American system of economics back over the Atlantic and the Pacific, consciously seeking the end to the British Empire system of world domination. In Russia, American railroad engineers worked with Russian Transportation Minister Count Sergei Witte, Dmitry Mendeleev, and others to organize a system of high tariffs and construction of the Trans-Siberian Rail project, modeled on Lincoln's American Transcontinental. The very first locomotive on this Trans-Siberian was built in Philadelphia by the Baldwin Company. By 1890, the Russians were planning a Bering Strait bridge to connect by rail to America. In France, heavy tariffs were instituted, along with an expansion of rail. French Foreign Minister Gabriel Hanotaux developed plans for the development of the Nile River area of Africa and for a rail link to the Russian Trans-Siberian project. In Japan, E. Kashine Smith, a close collaborator of Henry Carey, traveled to Japan's Meiji court to shape the rapid transformation of the country into a modern industrial power. The Japanese became a leading American ally in Asia, creating the first ever independent national bank on that continent. In China, where the British had unloaded crates of opium, American Civil War engineers unloaded crates of Baldwin locomotives. Carey ally Horton Barker worked with the Chinese Emperor's circles for the creation of a joint Chinese-American bank to fund telegraph lines, rail, and industrial mining. And in Germany, the American system reached its greatest application anywhere outside the United States through the actions of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who had been an ally of the American system from the days of his youth.
Bismarck himself had been a close friend of some of the American students who had been explicitly sent over by Jonathan Seattle to study at Göttingen, at Jena, at Berlin, to basically study universal history as it was taught by Schiller and by the von Humboldt.
3 years after the American Centennial, Bismarck broke Germany's free trade system, implementing an American-inspired tariff policy for Germany. The kinship between Germany and the U.S. became so strong at the time that Republican Congressman and Civil War veteran William McKinley quoted Bismarck's speech for a German tariff from the floor of the U.S. Congress.
The success of the United States in material development is the most illustrious of modern times. The American nation
They probably don't want me living in Virginia
suppressed the most gigantic and extensive war of all history, but immediately afterward disbanded its army
found employment for all of its soldiers and marines, paid off most of its debt, given labor and homes to all the unemployed of Europe as fast as they could arrive within its territory, and still by a system of taxation so indirect as not to be perceived, much less felt. Because it is my deliberate judgment that the prosperity of America is mainly due to its system of protective laws, I urge that Germany has now reached that point where it is necessary to imitate the tariff system of the United States.
Under this policy, just as had occurred in the United States, Germany emerged as a national power on the world stage. Bismarck circles, in collusion with French industrialists, began planning rail links to the Trans-Siberian system of Russia and the construction of a Berlin to Baghdad rail system to create a new, previously non-existent trade route to all corners of the world. Second world leadership of the British East India Company based itself on relationships to control the world's sea routes and enforced underdevelopment of interior land masses. The acquisition of strategic naval ports, or choke points, marked here in red, was the pivot of the system. By controlling these ports and corresponding sea lanes, the British dominated trade, using colonies such as India or African nations as sources of cheap raw materials and slave labor. Other nations wishing to engage in the same geographical area would have to operate
Man,
near
it's
the
weird.
British.
I'll hear your fucking call, girls.
Transcontinental Rail project of the post-Civil War period, therefore, emphasizing interior development of land masses, such as Lincoln's American Transcontinental, Sergei Witta's Trans-Siberian, and Bismarck's Berlin-Baghdad system, were a mortal threat to the historic maritime-based power of the British Empire.
We were aggressively promoting the American system, and the British at that point decided that the only thing that they could do to prevent the successful spread of the American system and the build-up of these rail connections and the land bridge across Eurasia was to blow up the world. Literally, they were losing the chess game badly, and so their only last option was to kick over the chess game.
Under this geopolitical view, British imperial policy toward the end of the 19th century turned to the creation of a great world war, pivoted on pitting Russia and Germany against each other. The intention of this policy was not for any nation to come out as the victor, but rather for all nations involved to be destroyed.
Well, I'm tired of mediating shit.
Bismarck was conscious of this geopolitical strategy. In correspondence he wrote about his...
You can't fucking feed off one man's head there when you're not expected to get fucked up anyway.
You know what I mean? Destroy her war and economic ruin.
Bismarck was committed to alliances, which
It's like,
allowed
yeah,
for Germany to
portable wind turbines mined and
but he
destroyed.
also
Now move on.
understood that these alliances required the benefit of the other. That is, that the unification of Germany occurred in the war against France and Austria. But he was willing to form an alliance with Austria. He had his own alliance with France because he realized that if he were at war with these countries, Germany wouldn't be able to develop. So his commitment to the three Kaiser route, the alliance with Russia, the alliance with Austria, that wasn't popular with some of the smaller German states that were incorporated in Germany. But Bismarck's argument was that this policy created the best potential for Germany to develop its industry, to increase its markets, and to have peace.
He also negotiated with the Russian Tsar. Secretly, behind the back of his own Kaiser. Because the Kaiser was granted with the Kaiser of Austria, the sort of Tsar, in a Balkan War. The Balkan War involved Slavic peoples who were part of the Orthodox Church of Russia. There was an attempt by the British to organize another religious war between Orthodox and Western and Eastern Christianity. He knew you don't do that. So he entered into a secret agreement. He did. Behind the back of his Kaiser. Two Kaisers. The first Kaiser and the second. Wilhelm I and Wilhelm II was completely British. And said that he would sabotage.
Well, I'm well fucking aware that the KGB thinks they got all the police brainwashed down here as well as everybody else.
So as long as he was in power, the war couldn't go on because the British plan was to have Russia and France attack Germany at the same time, and to use the Habsburg Balkan War as a trigger for that purpose. So, sabotage.
Bismarck's insight and diplomatic
skill
thwarted all British attempts to pit Germany against Russia in war. His understanding of how European powers were manipulated by the British and his common policy of alliances with nations for peace meant that for a British orchestrated world war to succeed, Bismarck had to be eliminated. During these years, Prince Edward Albert, the protege of Lord Palmerston and son of Queen Victoria, made himself dictator of British foreign policy. For the next 20 years, he would personally oversee the elimination of all obstacles to the creation of a nightmare of coalitions, beginning with Otto von Bismarck. His greatest weapon in his work was not the gunboat, but insight into turning the vices and weaknesses of individuals into the most destructive weapons against them. The removal of Bismarck began with the use of one of Edward's greatest allies, his in-depth knowledge of the personal defects of his nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany.
Edward Albert, and partly was able to operate through this insane oligarchical royal family system, where, you know, the Tsar of Russia, the Kaiser of Germany, they're all part of his family. They're all offshoots of Queen Victoria. You know, and when you think of an oligarch, you got to think of a termite mound. With the queen termite, this gigantic blob about 20 times the size of her consort, pumping out eggs. And every other termite is there to aid the queen and reign.
When you have a bunch of noblemen who intermarry, you have family connections, but you also weaken the bloodline, so to speak. And so you had these figures like Kaiser William II, very inferior intellect, very much influenced by the pomp and circumstance of the empire. Kaiser William II, I think in 15 years, had 37 design changes in the costumes in the guard. He loved parades, but he was also desirous of flattery. He was very insecure. And so a court around him started saying from the moment he emerged, you can't be like Frederick the Great, his ancestor, if you have a Bismarck running policy.
Under orders from Prince Edward Albert, Kaiser Wilhelm ousted Bismarck from the German chancellorship in 1890. This event marked the beginning of World War I. The long fuse of the British Empire's attack on the American system was now lit. After his ouster, Bismarck foretold the great coming war.
For my part, I am no longer under any obligations towards the personalities now in office or towards my successor. All the bridges have been broken down. The ties which used to connect us with Russia have been severed. Personal authority and confidence are lacking in Berlin. If the country is well ruled, the coming war may be averted. If it is badly ruled, that war may become a 7-year war.
Prince Edward Albert and his sycophants now unleashed hell on earth. The nightmare coalition of Russia, France, and Britain, which Bismarck had worked to prevent, Edward now sought to create. Every nation in Europe and Asia which had responded to the United States' successes would be targeted for destruction. In 1894, French President Sadi Carnot was assassinated. Edward's Anglophile circles within the weakened French government then launched the Dreyfus Scandal. This involved the fraudulent conviction of French Army Captain Alfred Dreyfus, of Jewish-German descent, as a traitor. This scandal would continue for 12 years, giving birth to an anti-German and anti-Semitic right-wing turn in France. Temporarily overcoming his known disdain for the yellow races, Edward Albert and his sons, through continuous official visits to Japan, personally organized the brainwashing of the Emperor Meiji of Japan. Albert, as he had also done with Wilhelm, preyed on Japan's island inequality. You are an island in Asia, just as we are an island in Europe. As we rule over Europe, you shall rule over Asia. With England's help, Japan will become a great naval power. Under this direction, Japan launched war against China in 1894, using its largely British-built navy and grabbing huge tracts of Chinese territory where U.S. and Russian industrialists had hoped to build critical links to the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Although the advances achieved in the wake of Lincoln's Civil War victory were being quickly crushed in Europe and Asia, the United States remained at this time a stronghold of power and independence against the British Empire.
Then I get fucked
Under newly elected
again and
president,
again and
legal
again
devotee
for
William
fucking
McKinley,
years. I'm
economic
supposed to
and
be
political
fucking all
progress
merry and
were
lie.
charging
Oh,
forward.
the government really fucking
McKinley's commitment to
the
the
best shit
continuation of
ever.
U.S.
They're
policy
brainwashing
against free
everybody
trade
around here, making
were
my
more
life shit.
explicit than any United States president had ever made them.
So I say, fuck it.
30 years of protection has brought us to the first rank in agriculture, in mining, and in manufacturing development. We lead all nations in the
If I was getting paid, I wouldn't be bitching about it. Get it?
We've outstripped even the United Kingdom, which had centuries to start.
I remember I used to have a normal
Her
fucking
fiscal
life.
policy for 50 years past has been the free trade, revenue tariff policy of the Democrats. Ours, for 31 years, the protective tariff policy of the Republicans. Tried by any test, measured by any standard, we lead all the rest of the world. Protection had vindicated itself.
McKinley immediately adopted a tariff policy, protection policy, that had the British freaked out. In fact, the British sent key operatives over to the United States to work in 1896 in the campaign against McKinley.
McKinley's election was a major obstacle to the British Empire's
Yeah, the guy in black vans fucked me over using my voice everywhere. So now he's fucking over here across the street. Is that what that guy was saying?
The International American Conference's proposal for expansion of the U.S. railway system through Mexico to the tip of South America. This project, if completed in conjunction with the Russian plans for a Bering Strait railway, would make it possible by the beginning of the 20th century to travel from Western Europe to the southern pole of the Western Hemisphere by rail. But when McKinley's vice president died in 1899, British Allied bankers seized the opportunity. Teddy Roosevelt was forced on as McKinley's new vice president for the next election. Teddy Roosevelt was as far as one could get from a Lincoln Republican. A sworn Anglophile, his love for the British Empire and its system of racial hierarchy were due to two key individuals. One was his uncle, James Dunwoody Bullock, who, during the Civil War, had served in England as the head of the Confederate Secret Service. Bullock procured the entire Confederate Navy, which destroyed Union ships and blockaded the South, prolonging the war. Teddy Roosevelt considered Bullock one of his personal heroes and traveled to meet his exiled uncle in England in 1886 to be tutored on naval war strategy. American trader Alfred Thayer Mahan, author of The Influence of Sea Power on History, was the other major influence on Teddy Roosevelt. Mahan frequented the Royal Societies and clubs of Prince Edward Albert's England, promoting their new post-Civil War vision of an Anglo-American naval empire.
Mahan's leading proponent in the United States was Theodore Roosevelt. When Mahan's book was published, very few people read it.
What?
Roosevelt
Kiwi
bought up as
fucked?
many copies as he could.
Ingleside fucked?
Distributed it
Flower Buck
throughout
totally
the,
fucked?
Congress.
And you come over here and blame me for getting fucked?
McKinley continued
After
to
you
organize the
fucked everything?
transcontinental rail projects despite Teddy Roosevelt and his British allies in the White House. 6 months into his second term, he delivered a rousing speech to the Pan American Conference in Buffalo to 50,000 North and South Americans.
Yeah, they probably have traveled all
Next day,
around the world trying to fuck me
McKinley was
over
murdered
and
by
every
an
place they
anarchist,
fucking possibly
deployed
could.
by the same Emma Goldman anarchist networks which had killed President Carnot of France 7 years previous. As Goldman would later admit, it was London that was the base of operations for her international terrorist movement.
The killing of McKinley was done by the British. It was done by it was
get rid of him. Brought in Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was trained by his uncle, who was the chief of the So you have the presidency of the United States by assassination of Teddy Roosevelt.
This derailment of the Lincoln legacy in the United States ensured that Edward Albert, now King Edward VII, would meet no resistance from the U.S. In 1904, by preying on the continuing Germanophobia connected to the Dreyfus affair and a humiliating defeat of the French army by the British at Fashoda, Edward and his French agents rammed through the Entente Cordiale agreement with France. The pivot of this friendship treaty included binding commitments for collaboration in future war. On the other side of Eurasia, Britain's other new subject, Japan, was poised to launch another war, this time against Russia. The Japanese emperor had signed an Anglo-Japan treaty in 1902, the central feature being that in the event of a Japanese-Russian war, Britain would prevent other European powers from aiding in Russia's defense. With the green light thus on, British banks had increased loans to Japan for arms and warship production. As the Entente Cordiale was being Japan launched a devastating sneak attack on the Russian naval station of Port Harbor, foreshadowing the Pearl Harbor attack 37 years later against the United States. By 1985, the Japanese war against Russia had achieved its objective. The Russian nation was crippled. Only one capital ship remained in its navy. The resources of the country were exhausted. After the peace treaty, orchestrated by U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, a revolution was run against the Tsar, further weakening his ability to govern. The optimistic vision of Russian leaders like Sergei Witte for a tramway of iron rail girding the world had been replaced by the bleak practicalities of war and British.
Yeah, they put KGB operatives in fucking witness protection,
King
put them in
Edward bestowed the
mansions,
most noble British order of knighthood,
pay all their
Royal Order
fucking
of the Garter,
bills.
on the Japanese emperor, an order so esteemed it was only possessed by the king and 25
You
knights
help the
around him.
CIA, you get fucked.
The summer of that year, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia met on a yacht in the Baltic Sea.
The Tsar feels a deep personal anger at England and the king. Called Edward VII the greatest mischief maker and the most dangerous and deceptive intriguer in the world. I could only agree with him, adding that I especially had had to suffer from his intrigues in recent years. He has a passion for plotting against every power, of making a little agreement, whereupon the Tsar interrupted me, striking the table with his fist and saying, "Well, I can only say he shall not get one from me, and never in my life against Germany or you. My word of honor upon it."
Tsar Nicholas of Russia would not keep his word of honor for long. Within 2 years of this discussion, in 1907, the Tsar signed a war alliance with King Edward's Britain, arranging Russia in a triple partnership with France and Britain against Wilhelm's Germany, the very trap Nicholas had sworn to his cousin he would avoid. In the absence of Otto von Bismarck, no one remained to prevent King Edward's orchestration
Spun
of
a
a
web of
nightmare
deceit,
coalition.
and nobody's supposed to realize it.
Coincident
I
to
don't think
arranging a
anybody
series of
trusts the
troubling
government.
developments, King Edward VII was maintaining perhaps
Not even their own
the warmest
fucking
correspondence between an English monarch and a U.S. president in history. Edward wrote Teddy letters about how the two of them had been placed in command of the two great branches of the Anglo-Saxon race, while Teddy responded that the real interests of the English-speaking peoples are one, alike in the Atlantic and the Pacific. As president, Teddy Roosevelt shut down McKinley's Pan American Rail project. He created East India Company-inspired conservation parks, denying settlers access to land intended by Lincoln for development. And he walked softly with a big stick all over the Monroe Doctrine, turning the U.S. from the leading enemy of empire in the Western Hemisphere to its leading friend. With the post-Civil War power of the U.S. thus chained to British interest, the last fateful steps to the ignition of war were lit in the Balkans.
What the British want to do is take an area where there's a confluence of division. You have Roman Catholic, Serbian Orthodox churches, you have some Muslim elements. It's all the leftovers of the Ottoman Empire and the conflicts of the Ottoman Empire. And the British view is we can foment conflict virtually at the drop of a hat in these places.
In June of 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Ferdinand, rode through Sarajevo, Bosnia, and was assassinated by an anarchist. Predictably, the Austrians reacted by declaring war on Serbia. Tsar Nicholas II mobilized to defend the Serbs, and so likewise the German, French, and British entered the conflict. The Great War, whose fuse had been burning since King Edward's ouster of Chancellor Bismarck, went off.
Indeed, the war just started because the war started. There was no reason for the war to start. Everything was in place. There was a buildup of conflict. Every side was building up more of their military capability. Orders were going out.
Delta 3, your December is going to be 131, repeat 0131.
But this is a British plan to set this in motion.
This is what happens when you have inadequate leadership. William II was a terrible emperor in Germany. Tsar Nicholas of Russia, was incompetent. The French government was incapable of addressing the broader situation of Russia. They were all putty in the hands of the British manipulators. The British wanted World War I to destroy continental Europe. And you look at the incredible numbers of people who died. And you see what a tragedy is about.
But really, the key to this is Europe is destroyed and demoralized. Because the idea is, how did this happen to us? We're supposed to be civilized, we have science, we have parliamentary democracies, we have culture, and we engaged in a meat grinder where people were slaughtered over inches of ground.
6 southbound in Morgan, 26 southbound in Morgan. Should be a green vehicle leaving driving recklessly. License plate Frank Charles Boyd 4187. Frank Charles Boyd 4187. Patrol 2 at 2256.
An avid Ku Klux Klan supporter, Wilson's election had been made possible by Teddy Roosevelt, who ran a third-party Bull Moose ticket in 1912, splitting enough votes from incumbent Republican William Taft to secure Wilson's victory.
Under somebody like McKinley or a successor, the U.S. probably would have stayed out. But under Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, both with the history of tied to the Confederacy, the United States ultimately comes in on the British side.
24-year-long orchestration of World War I by King Edward VII thoroughly shattered the possibility of ending the British Empire. In Europe and Asia, each nation which had embraced the American system in the wake of Lincoln's assassination had been roped into destroying itself. In the United States, the Lincoln legacy was all but lost, with Woodrow Wilson closely tying the U.S. to support of British imperial interest for the post-war world. The British Empire itself, now more in control of world politics than possibly ever before, positioned itself to eradicate the potential for the Lincoln legacy to arise again by moving for the permanent eradication of sovereign nation-states. For this, the deceased Edward VII's policy of steering nations into self-destruction would be continued, but around new figures such as H.G. Wells, who had served as the director of British intelligence during World War I. Wells and his collaborators began for another great war, this one to wipe away nations and pave the way for world government.
Wells was a particularly nasty, evil, but very intelligent guy. And so, in both his literary writings, his novels, his short stories, and then in his non-literary, non-fiction writing, particularly his Open Conspiracy, what Wells laid out is the idea that you have to create world government.
We mean to stop them. That's all, if you will. Well, I think we know how we
post-war period reflected the exact age of Jewish. The Versailles Treaty of 1919, imposing nearly all of the post-war reparations on Germany, meant an undoing of all of Bismarck's previous successes and a dissolution of Germany as a sovereign country. At one point, the most productive agricultural lands and natural resources were seized. Ships, locomotives, and half of the nation's gold reserves were taken away. Social programs were eliminated, industries privatized, and vicious waves of speculation unleashed on the Deutschmark. The Reichsbank desperately printed mountains of currency in the vain hope of covering the unpayable debt, leading to the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. The British had finally reconquered Germany. In Southwest Asia, the same policy was pursued. Secret negotiations with the British Oil Bureau and French Foreign Ministry had created the Sykes-Picot Accord, which mandated British control of the Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq region, and French control of Lebanon and Syria. Still to this day, the manipulation of religious and ethnic tensions to create repositioning of empire. In the United States, the same banks and cartels dismantling the German nation positioned themselves for similar actions against the already weakened American system. J.P. Morgan's bank, located at 23 Wall Street, had been established as the American arm of the British rank and steered as an insurrection into American finance since the 1860s.
Yeah, fuck you.
The House of American companies, industries, and utilities.
Yeah, I can't see the wall, supposedly.
It was this vast collection network which would take over the political parties, install a series of London and Wall Street controlled presidents like Calvin Coolidge, and advise the dismantling of the American system. By 1928, John J. Raskob, a J.P. Morgan asset, who had built his fortune
if the FBI or CIA is listening. They don't give a fuck. I've learned that after 7 years. In fact, they probably shoot somebody in the innocent, unarmed man in the back in front of the fucking CIA. Oh, we'll just go to Johnny's house and make a fucking bunch of radio shit to cover it up. Well, thank God. You ain't gonna protect us. That's how the fucking cops are.
Lamont was a financial liaison to both Imperial Japan and Mussolini's Italy. In 1925,
I mean, look what kind of police department you're looking at. They turned to KGB for help to cover up when they committed fucking crime. Fuck.
This same Thomas Lamont also provided daily consultation to the U.S. President Herbert Hoover. In October of 1929, the rampant speculation of the 1920s culminated in Black Friday.
It was the 1922 line collapse. It was collapse of this thing, a period of dominated by euphoria. You can't beat the system. This is our system here. Everything is fine. You can't beat
the world's fucked with the system.
Hold on. We're going to live with the system. We're going to live with the system. We adapt to the system. We're going to be successful. We're going to make it.
Yeah, the police department said they learned how to control Johnny. They claim it's my system. Whatever. Yeah, well, whatever. Argue with the rest of the world, because it's a global system, you stupid fucks.
Industrial and agricultural.
Relax.
Basic economy.
Yeah.
But you really headed in the direction of social change.
That was great. Then 1930, 31, 32, 33. It was horrible. People you'd see the crowd waiting at the soup kitchens to eat breakfast in Manhattan, lined up. Rest. In the previous time. Now they're all with the top hats, their suits, and so forth. They're out there.
This was a very dangerous period. This was the period when there was an effort by the Morgan interests to put a fascist government in power.
Yeah, pretty much the whole neighborhood's turned into a terror hotel number.
This was the period of the Spanish Revolution when the fascist regime of Franco was put in. Hitler was in power. Mussolini was in power. there was a
What's my terror number?
pro-fascist movement
5.
centered around
This is Terror Hotel 5. How you doing down there, Terror Hotel 6? Terror Hotel 7, you still alive?
Record on the ground by Reich Bank President Gelmar Schacht. Millions of dollars were invested into the Nazi Party.
You think I like being Terror Hotel 5?
Hindenburg was pressured to put Hitler in as the chancellor, and by February 27th, 1933,
Fucking
the
police.
building was set on fire by a Nazi party member. The Nazis blamed this on the Communist Party and then used the fear inspired by the events as a pretext to give Hitler emergency dictatorial powers. The economic crash in the United States had snowballed into widespread hunger, bankruptcy, foreclosures, and 25% unemployment. People were not in a position to pay attention to the ominous rumblings abroad. Yet interest in the coming elections was unprecedented. Voters fervently hoped to find a leader who would, against all odds, turn them away from despair and restore the nation to prosperity. As the Democratic Convention neared, the Raskov-directed Democratic National Committee would go to extraordinary lengths to win the presidency. Their only opposition lay with a Democrat named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The party rules at the time were that the candidate to be nominated needed 2/3 of the delegates to win. Franklin Roosevelt had slightly less than that. Only a few states needed to join to his side, and he could win. The method that was plotted against him by the DNC was to keep the votes separate through as many ballots as possible until the delegates would break form and the convention might end up in a deadlock where the party would elect a compromise candidate of the DNC's choosing.
They have various candidates available, any one of whom would have been acceptable as long as it wasn't Franklin Roosevelt.
Their idea was that if they could get 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 ballots, that they could eventually convince supporters of Roosevelt who couldn't make it, they should drop their support for him.
Well, if 20 million people hear me, why do you think I'm singling your home?
To ensure none of the delegates voted his opponents created a chaotic atmosphere at the convention.
Really?
They paid street
If 20,000 viewers hear me, why the fuck do you think I'm singling out your residents?
The city to be anti-Roosevelt to create a fog of confusion. They even went to the extent of pressuring Roosevelt's delegates to break from him while they ate at restaurants and while going to their hotel rooms in the interim hours of the convention. Roosevelt did not get enough on the first ballot, the second, or the third. In each vote, he made only small gains. Campaign manager Howe and Roosevelt both knew that if at any point he lost votes, he would be out.
When the fourth vote comes up, and Roosevelt's in direct communication with Howe and Farley, and basically their ideas, they got together on this vote.
A mysterious telegram began to circulate at this point of the convention. A telegram intended to disorganize the Roosevelt delegates.
The way out of quiet conviction the party can unite on a man who is stronger than any of the leading contenders. That man is Lincoln Bigger.
Roosevelt responded to this effort to demoralize his supporters by sending his own telegram from Hyde Park, New York.
I am in this fight to stay. This is a battle for principle. According to the convention understands that it is being waged to keep our party as a whole from dictation by a small group representing the interests of the nation which have no place in the telegraphs now being sent to delegates. It is clear that the nation must not and shall not be overridden. Now is the time to make clear that we intend to stand fast and win.
Morgan and Brownlee for no rush.
military struggle, but a conflict over whether the Lincoln tradition of American politics or the British system of empire would prevail. Franklin Roosevelt knew this to be the issue of the convention. He knew this not as a recent discovery, but something which was fundamental to his thinking throughout his life.
In Roosevelt's case, there was a very explicit sense of history. Now, the earliest I can identify it is this paper they write from Hamilton. I think when he's about in his late teens or something like that. It's clear that he does have a sense, like Lincoln, of being a continuation of the American Revolution, and his sense of identity is in the American Revolution. Now, I think it's very interesting, even though it's a very short paper, and obviously it's not a big scholarly exercise, it's more his own sense of who Hamilton was.
George Washington, the first president under the Constitution, made Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury, the greatest of the cabinet officers. As Hamilton had stabilized the problems of state, so now he ordered the finances of the country. It was his impetus to remove for all time the risk of disintegration of the states. None appreciated this solidarity more than Aaron Burr, who, defeated for the presidency in his race against Jefferson in 1800, largely through the efforts of Hamilton, saw in this greater financial security the banishment of his dream of establishing the Northern Confederacy.
Roosevelt was aware, even in his system, that it was an American system as great as the British versus the British. Roosevelt's great-great-grandfather was a close collaborator of Alexander Hamilton in the creation of the Bank of New York, of some of the strategy around the establishment of the First National Bank. Isaac Roosevelt was a great American patriot of that period, and his portrait hung in the dining room of the Roosevelt family home up in Hyde Park, New York. So I think he had a very personal connection to the founding fathers, to, in particular, Hamilton, maybe because of his grandfather's ties to them. And it gives you a sense how somebody lives. Hamilton lived in Roosevelt. And that was his, I think, idea.
In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt, then only 38, had been selected by the Democratic Party as the vice presidential candidate. He stumped the country. Franklin visited
how long's Lewis Mechanical been playing CIA with their black steel bullshit? 4 or 5 years now.
Of natural resources and improving the working and living conditions of the population. Amidst this momentum, Franklin contracted the life-threatening disease poliomyelitis.
At a critical moment in his political career, he had to drop out of politics and concentrate his every effort on battling the life-threatening disease.
Franklin and his family turned this period of illness and convalescence into a constructive period of his education into all fields.
There are times when I think that Franklin may never have been president if he had not been stricken. You see, he had 1,000 interests. You couldn't pin him down. Then suddenly there he was, flat on his back, with nothing to do with it. He began to read, he began to think, he talked, he gathered people around him. His thoughts expanded, his horizon widened.
He realized even more profoundly that it's the human being's mental capabilities, the human mind, that is who you are, and that's your strength. And if you rely on that, in effect, you could be the president of the United States, even though you're...
Why don't they just fucking pay me to move?
The physical side means nothing.
I can't afford to fucking move because he won't let me work.
I saw Roosevelt only once, between 1921 and 1924.
Doesn't make sense, does it? Lewis Mechanical fucks your business over, but they want nothing more to run you out of your fucking business and your home. But they won't let you fucking work. That's why I said, Lewis Mechanical, their shit's stupid as fuck. They wanted me out of here, they'd let me fucking make money, instead of bashing my wind turbine business, making it so I can't fucking work out back, and fucking destroying my fucking wind turbines and shit out there. You know? I mean, it's like they've got us stuck here. And then they bitch about us fucking and try to run us out. Like, what? The only escape is suicide because Lewis Mechanical's next door? No, how about I blow up their goddamn building? Lewis Mechanical will run around and call me a terrorist all I want. Nobody fucking believe him.
Franklin to run for governor of New York and to
I'm
address
tired of
the
their shit.
1928 Democratic Convention.
All they do all day long is fucking make Spawn shit all day long. Spawn says this, Spawn says that, Spawn's fucking Johnny, it's not Spawn, Spawn says it's not Lewis, Spawn is Lewis, Spawn says it's Lewis, says this. You know, they cut with their ass. I'm just like fucking sick of it.
Must be interested in whether that national destination be heaven or
And I
hell.
know where Lewis McKinkle learned it from, the fucking police department.
The wheel has assured us that we shall find a full bank account and a soft bed. We do not want to change these United States of America into the United States Incorporated with a limited and self-perpetuating board of directors and no voting power in the common stockholders.
Once elected governor, Franklin began to reverse the ongoing economic disintegration by implementing policies of Social Security, unemployment insurance, major state infrastructure, job creation projects, regulation over utilities, and initial regulation of Wall Street. This prescription...
Yeah, well, you drive around your Black Ranger and talk about sucking Lewis blood and black steel cars. Man, I don't give a fuck. Fucking stupid fucking bastard.
When Lincoln was one of our own. The Republican Party has certainly repudiated, first and last, everything that he stood for. Those in charge of the national government believed that individual and collective private action could restore the prosperity, and that the restoration of such prosperity is the sole objective.
By 1930, the Republican Party had become the party of financial speculation and free trade. In the midterm election of that year, the Democrats gained a majority in both congressional houses, and the next presidential election was expected to deliver similar results. Lewis Howe had planned a presidential bid for Franklin in the 1936 election, but the nation's economic conditions prompted an earlier run. Because of his success as governor in New York, Franklin was seen by many to be the likely Democratic Party nominee. To combat Franklin, early in the campaign cycle, John Russell moved to repeal prohibition in the forefront of the party politics. This issue was intended to create a wedge between the Northern and the Southern Democrats, and in a letter to the party published in early 1932,
They can fucking Spawn medical in my house.
not ready to come together around this issue. The Democratic Party should break up, and a third Liberal Party should be formed. Franklin perceived the true intention of these actions as an attempt by a financial elite to undermine the Democratic Party's chances in the election and retain control of the nation's economic policies.
I know that you will agree with me in believing that we face in this country the concentration of all power, economic and political, in the hands of what the ancient Greeks would have called oligarchy.
Going into the 1932 convention, you had people who were outright fascists and Nazis, who were the American equivalent of the Montague Norman, Hjalmar Schacht, and the European bankers, who wanted to install Hitler because they wanted a war in Europe. And so Roosevelt was facing those kinds of obstacles.
To combat this control from an elite few of the Democratic Party, Franklin invented the fireside chats in order to educate the population about the problems America faced and to muster support for his intended policy solutions.
These unhappy times call for the building of plans that rest upon the forgotten, the unorganized, but the indispensable units of economic power. Plans that build from the bottom up and not from the top down, that put their faith once more in the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. It is high time to admit with courage that we are in the midst of an emergency at least equal to that of war. Let us mobilize to meet it.
In this situation, Roosevelt attracted, especially the people in the lower 80% of the income bracket, to attack them to do something. And we had a deeper cultural war.
Yeah, the Lewis Black Vehicle cult. Trying to run around and convince people to CI and blame it on my house.
You're right. But you know, under our system, that's not right. You don't look at the style. Not our way of doing things. So he can appeal to that sense of justice.
Yeah, whatever.
Fairness. Just call it fairness. In the American population.
Yeah, we've listened to Lewis McKinkle play CI for
to Main Street. He laid the basis for what he did in his governorship.
Did they burn out his house in Flower Well?
Exactly. He was up against it. Not safe unless we got rid of the
Now you don't want to disclose his new address because they're fucking out there fucking
after earning a majority of the popular support during the primaries that came into the Democratic Party convention of 1932. A nomination of Roosevelt would mean the revival of Lincoln's legacy. A victory of anyone else would ensure an end of the United States.
Roosevelt came into the convention as the clear favorite of the American people, yet the party apparatus was dead set against Roosevelt getting the nomination.
Amidst the chaos of the convention, the Roosevelt apparatus persisted. Cracks started to develop among the different constituencies, and ultimately, an American response came from the participants of the convention. Enough people realized that Roosevelt was the only alternative to the Wall Street Party, and that he was the only one committed and prepared to govern in the interests of the United States. A deal was brokered. The California and Texas delegations broke for Roosevelt, and he secured the nomination.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, having received more than two-thirds of all the delegates voting, I proclaim him the nominee of this convention for President of the United States.
Although this pleased the people in the convention, it did not please Raskol and his masters.
It seems unbelievable that the Democratic Party, born and bred in the fine old aristocracy of the South, and always fostered and nourished by a conservative people, such as Smith, P.S. Dupont, and myself, has now turned into a radical group such as Roosevelt.
Hearing of his nomination, Roosevelt broke tradition, took a major risk at the time, and flew an airplane to Chicago in order to address the people of the convention directly and to draw the battle lines of his campaign.
There are two ways of viewing the government's duty in matters affecting economic and social life. One is to see to it that a favored few are helped, and hopes that some of their prosperity will leak through, sift through to labor, to the farmer, to the small businessman. That theory belongs to the party of Toryism, and I had hoped that most of the Tories left this country in 1776. Our Republican leaders tell us economic laws, sacred, inviolable, unchangeable, cause panics which no one could prevent. But while they prate of economic laws, men and women are starving. We must lay hold of the fact that economic laws are not made by nature. They are made by human beings.
The power that parties get is significant as a factor of the scene. Most decisive is the leadership, which is always centered in one or two or more individual minds, who are actually driving history with ideas, as Roosevelt, with ideas.
By the election in November of 1932, Roosevelt won and was ready to begin his New Deal for the nation.
And look, my friend, like a real landslide this time.
In Florida, 2 weeks before Roosevelt's inauguration, an anarchist emerged from a crowd and fired 5 shots at Roosevelt. The bullets intended for Roosevelt did not hit their mark, but undoubtedly Roosevelt knew, much like President-elect Lincoln before him knew, who his enemies were. On March 4, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 31st President of the United States.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into
who was able to fundamentally transform the United States with this idea of the American system. Roosevelt understood this. He understood it from the studies of Hamilton. I'm sure he also understood Lincoln's policy very clearly, because he, so much of it was in his
Yeah, John Brennan ain't working for the CIA
Within
no more.
hours of his first day in office, Roosevelt began a comprehensive reorganization of the nation's economy. Illustrated is the case of Chief Aide Harry Hopkins, who, armed with only a card table, a pot of coffee, and a telephone, hired 11 million Americans and spent $20 million in the first 3 hours of the administration. With the Civilian Conservation Corps, Rural Electrification Administration, the Four Corners Projects, and others, Roosevelt launched the largest peacetime mobilization of manpower and materials the world had ever seen. As an incredible example, the Tennessee Valley Authority transformed one of the most backward areas of the nation into an industrial powerhouse.
This was the plan: to chain the river through a series of giant dams, checking the flood. Open it to navigation from its mouth to its headwaters. To give the farmers the benefit of modern science and research. To help them control the water on their land and restore the fertility of
Yeah, meanwhile, Jerry Chang Lee is fucking robbing the CIA of state secrets while John Brennan's busy fucking around.
To use the electric power generated by the dams to develop and rehabilitate industry in the cities. To electrify the farms through rural cooperatives. Above all,
Yeah, I thought John Brennan was straight through.
Can be solved by reason, science, and education.
Roosevelt used the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a quasi-national bank to reestablish the credit of the nation. He built schools, libraries, airports, post offices, and all with government-issued credit. He reestablished the U.S. currency, stabilized the price of gold, and opened a penetrating investigation.
Yeah, I'm well aware of Donald Trump doesn't like John Brennan.
All within the first 100
Maybe
days
there's
of
more
his
reason.
But what he wanted to do is move immediately to stop the foreclosures, put people back in
Probably
homes,
because John
save
Brennan's
the
a fucking
farm,
Democrat.
build back farm income, and start up U.S. industry again. And to a large extent, he succeeded. Policies that Roosevelt instituted for rebuilding the U.S. economy completely flew in the face of these powerful Wall Street and City of London allied interests.
By the middle of 1933, Roosevelt's attacks against free trade practices were tearing up the privatized control of the U.S. economy. As a desperate reaction to Roosevelt and his American system policies, one of the most outlandish British-directed plots in modern history was planned. J.P. Morgan's John Raskob was tasked to form a group to propagandize against Roosevelt's policies. This organization, becoming active in most cities and states, fervently attacked Roosevelt with thousands of speeches and millions of pamphlets distributed across the nation.
Now I've been getting fucked by China and Russia for years. Worse than CIA doing all that shit.
The objective of
Playing
the
games
was to become the eventual administrator of a 500,000-man force which would storm the White House and overthrow President Roosevelt. The plan was to then establish a dictatorship which would immediately enact the economic austerity plans of Hjalmar Schacht's labor camps already being applied in Nazi Germany. All they needed was a man with credit among the military legions to lead this coup. Unfortunately for them, the man they tried to seduce was a true American, retired General Smedley Butler. He knew the corruption of government and big business intimately from his past, and refused to succumb to playing the role of an American Hitler. General Butler contacted his trusted Philadelphia publisher, and by the time enough evidence was collected to substantiate the story, Butler took this plot to the Senate, and as the press hit the stands, the hearings began. The plot was exposed.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
Yeah, I don't buy that.
Was only another step in Roosevelt's re-establishment of the strength of the U.S. Constitution as a living principle of government. His response to the coup attempt was to further recruit the population
shit, they
to the
probably don't
approaching
believe in
global
government
war
stuff.
against fascism and poverty.
Economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power, our allegiance, and our allegiance to America.
Well, my dad's already in a wheelchair with Alzheimer's in a nursing home, so he got fucked down here. I've been listening to him talk about doing it to my mother next. My dad was Democrat, he got fucked. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it. Spawning and politics shit. It's only this act like they control me when I'm talking my own and shit. Don't work either.
It is more than that. It is a war for the survival of democracy. We are fighting to save a great and precious form of government for ourselves and for the world. And so, I accept the commission you have tendered me. I join with you. I am enlisted for the duration of the war.
The story of the battles and the plans for World War II has been told over and over again. What has not been told is the story of the war between the American and the British systems to determine the future of civilization, which took place in discussions between the two individuals who represented these outlooks, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister of Britain, Winston Churchill. The story is perhaps best told through the eyes of Franklin Roosevelt's own son, Elliott Roosevelt, who attended and later transcribed many of these discussions.
Winston is at the dinner table, Father, and already giving quite a speech. Shall we go? He shall come to understand that must. World events are off the case of himself. What do you mean, Father? Winston would like to think I wasn't serious last time, but tonight is a different story. You know, Elliot, after flying over Africa, I've had some important thoughts about the future of the world. If you look at the Great Salt Flats in southern Tunisia, you can see that at one time it must have been a vast open sea. You also have the rivers that spring up the Amazon to the south and disappear under the Sahara to become subterranean rivers. Why not take these waters and divert this water flow for irrigation? It would make the Imperial Valley in California look like a cabbage patch. And the Salt Flats, they were once below the level of the Mediterranean. You can dig a canal straight back, recreate that lake, 150 miles long, 60 miles wide. The Sahara was womb for hundreds of miles. It is true, wealth. The Sahara is not just sand, it has amazingly rich potential. Imperialists don't realize what wealth is, what wealth they can create. They've robbed these continents of billions, and all because they were too short-sighted to understand that their billions were pennies compared to possibilities. Possibilities that must include a better life for the people who inhabit this land. Just then, Vice President Wallace came in.
I can't take this, Franklin. I just spent an hour talking with the British Foreign Minister. He was trying to convince me that after the war, the United States and the British have to continue the threat of
his rules. Henry, you need more finesse. You see, most of these folks are just victims of this old system. Their system uses them more than they use it. We've got to be impatiently patient, Henry. Frankly, we've got our very own fascists here in this country, just waiting to subvert us all over again. We have to move fast to solve this thing. Yes, but after the war, the cries will come that the present unity will no longer be necessary, and that's when the job will begin. One sentence. We've won the war. I will work with all my might and main to see to it that the United States is not wheedled into the position of accepting any plan that will further France's imperialistic ambitions or that will aid or prevent the British Empire in its imperial ambitions. Winston has got to listen to me this time. We'll find out. Father Wallace and I walked into the room together and sat down at the table. There were pleasant jokes and light discussions most of the evening. After making sure the Prime could hear him.
That makes sense. They put Bin Laden in witness protection and claim they dumped his body off the fucking ship.
My friend over there doesn't understand how most of our people feel about Britain and her role in the life of other people. It's in the American tradition, this distrust, this dislike, and even hatred of Britain. There are many kinds of Americans, of course, but as a people, as a country, we're opposed to imperialism. We can't stand it.
He looked at Churchill with a smile of significance. The Prime Minister sat like a Buddha, a big cigar in his face.
The point, which I'm having a hard time getting across to some people, is that many Americans are anti-British. Take me. God knows, and my friend knows, I'm not anti-British. Now, I remember very clearly that when I was 7 or thereabouts, in 1889 or 90, and my mother took me to England, and we saw Queen Victoria driving her carriage down the London street, why, I hated the old woman.
At this point, most of the dinner guests slowly made their way from the room, while Churchill sat there, sinking in his chair, immediately lighting another cigar. By the time the room cleared out, only Father, Churchill, Wallace, and myself. The discussion concerned the policies for after the war and Father's plans for a new economic system.
Those Empire trade agreements are a case in point. It's because of them that the people of India and Africa, of all the colonial Near East and Far East, are still as backward as they are.
Mr. President, England does not propose for a moment to lose its favored position among British dominion. The trade that has made England great shall continue under conditions prescribed by England.
Alexander Hamilton's reports prove that our American system strengthens the economy through developing the population. This is what has always worked and will work. It's principle. Bring about the industrialization of China. We could start tomorrow.
You have no idea what a mistake you will be making with that. We feel...
I am firmly of the belief that if we are to arrive at a stable peace, it must involve the development of backward countries, backward peoples. How can this be done? It can't be done, obviously, by 18...
Yeah, I got a video of the guy who looks like Bin Laden that wears the tan Carhartt. And then it activates tiny little hoe boys.
20th century methods involve bringing industry to these colonies. 20th century methods include increasing the wealth of the people by increasing their standard of living, by education, by bringing sanitation, by making sure they get a return for the raw wealth of their community. Take India, Winston. I can't believe that we can fight the war against fascist slavery and at the same time not work to free people all over the world from a backward colonial policy.
There can be no tampering with the Empire's economic agreement.
They're artificial.
They're the foundation of our greatness. Mr. President, I believe you are trying to do away with the British Empire. Every idea you entertain demonstrates it. In spite of that, we know that you constitute our own. And you know that we...
Yeah, fuck Bin Laden. Need to remove him or I'm gonna kill him. And fuck the U.S. government fucking goddamn basically sponsoring fucking terrorism.
Once Churchill had enough, he forced a smile, got up, and cordially bid us adieu. As he waddled away, Father picked up his things and spoke confidently to himself and also to me.
And fuck the CIA too.
We have a chance to use our influence in favor of
Now what's the fucking CIA done for me? Make me listen to shit.
Roosevelt's vision of the post-war agreements between the Big Four, the United States, Britain, China, and the Soviet Union, were for them to be responsible under the principles of the Atlantic Charter to form the United Nations, which would oversee the banishment of colonialism worldwide and bring the power of technological development to nations across the globe. Under the leadership of President Roosevelt, the United States created a potential for global cooperation, threatening the end of imperialism on the planet. For the first time since Lincoln's victory in the Civil War, the world was moving in the direction of defeating the oligarchical principle and establishing a global community of sovereign nation-states. Under the presidency of Roosevelt's chosen successor, Vice President Henry Wallace, that future would have been secured.
Yeah, I watched the homeless guy look like a bum and hang out around my house for a long time. All they did was talk shit about Johnny the whole time. KGB liked that shit probably.
All the rest becomes easy. This is a fight between a slave world and a free world. Just as the United States in 1862 could not remain half slave and half free, so in 1942 the world must make its decision for a complete victory one way or the other. The people, in their millennial and revolutionary march toward manifesting here on earth the dignity that is in every human soul, hold as their credo the four freedoms enunciated by President Roosevelt. We who live in the United States may think there is nothing very revolutionary about freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and freedom from the fear of secret police. But when we begin to think about the significance of freedom from want for the average man,
Yeah, this whole system's fucked.
then we know that the revolution of the past 150 years has not been completed, either here in the United States or in any other nation in the world. We know that this revolution cannot stop until freedom from want has been attained.
Tragically, President Roosevelt's health then took a dramatic turn for the worse, and as the war was coming to a close, the British operatives in the Democratic Party pressured Roosevelt to replace Wallace with Harry S. Truman in the 1944 election.